Welcome to this story, where we are transported to a humble village, where the dawn light gently seeps into the weaver's cottage. As the village stirs with the sounds of life, the weaver begins his day, weaving with steady hands, crafting fabric, from the wool of sheep and the natural dyes of the surrounding land. The story unfolds in a calm, rhythmic pace, following the weaver's quiet life and reflecting on the cycles of nature, seasons, and community. With each thread woven, memories and hopes are carried into the fabric, tying past and future together. As you listen, let the peaceful rhythm of the weaver's craft guide you into a tranquil state, where the soothing sounds and motions of the loom calm your mind and prepare you for rest. The village and its timeless beauty, the warmth of the hearth, and the gentle nightfall invite you to relax deeply and surrender to sleep, refreshed and renewed, ready for the quiet beauty of a new day. In the early morning light, the weaver sat at his loom, the rhythmic sound of the shuttle passing back and forth through the threads, creating a steady beat that filled the small cottage. His hands moved with practiced ease, pulling the yarn with precision and care, the fibers weaving together to create a tapestry that would tell the stories of the village, its people, and the land itself. The loom stood in the center of the room, its polished wooden frame gleaming softly in the light that filtered through the latticed window, casting long shadows on the warm wooden floor. The air in the room was thick with the scent of fresh wool and burning oak, a reminder of the day's work ahead and the warmth of the hearth that crackled nearby. The weaver had worked here for years, his father before him and his grandfather before that, each generation adding to the legacy of the craft that had been passed down through the centuries. As the shuttle passed through the warped threads, he thought of the patterns emerging from his hands, slowly coming together like a map of the village itself, the landscape he knew so well. Each thread was carefully chosen, dyed in rich colors drawn from the earth, the plants, the roots, the berries, and the flowers of the land. The colors reflected the beauty of the world around him, the deep greens of the forests, the soft browns of the earth, the muted blues of the sky, and the bright, sunny yellows of the fields. Each thread was a testament to the land, to the seasons, to the life of the village. And as the weaver worked, he thought of all the lives that had been touched by the fabric he created, the warmth it provided, and the stories it carried. The village beyond the cottage walls was slowly waking up, the sounds of children's laughter drifting in through the open window, the clatter of wooden carts as they rolled over the cobblestone streets, the distant calls of livestock stirring. In the morning light, life in the village was simple, yet rich with meaning. The weaver's work was a part of that life, a steady thread woven through the fabric of the community. As his hands moved with steady rhythm, he felt connected to the generations that had come before him, to the hands that had worked the loom and passed on their knowledge, to the stories they had woven into the fabric of the land. The weaver paused for a moment, glancing out the window at the fields beyond. The land was fertile, the soil rich, and the seasons flowed in a cycle as old as time. The village had prospered because of the land, and the people had thrived by working together, each contributing their part to the whole. The weaver's craft was no different. Each thread, each pass of the shuttle, each stitch in the fabric was a contribution to something greater, something timeless. As the shuttle moved through the loom once more, the weaver's thoughts turned inward. He thought of his family, of the children who would one day sit at the loom after him, weaving their own stories into the fabric of the village. He thought of the future, of the generations yet to come, and a quiet sense of peace settled over him. This work, this simple act of weaving, would continue long after he was gone. It would continue because it was more than just a craft. It was a way of life, a way of telling stories, a way of connecting to the past and the future. The loom had been passed down from father to son, from generation to generation, and it would continue to pass through the hands of those who came after. As the weaver worked, his hands steady, his mind quiet, he knew that he was part of something much larger than himself. The loom was the thread that connected the past, present, and future. And as he wove, he was adding his own story to the fabric of the world. The fabric grew longer with each pass of the shuttle, the patterns emerging slowly, intricately, telling a story only the loom could tell. The weaver's work was never hurried, never rushed. It was a slow, deliberate process, one that required patience and care. Each thread was woven with intention, each pattern formed with purpose. The loom was his canvas, and the thread his paint. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, the weaver continued his work, his hands moving fluidly between the warp and the weft, creating something beautiful, something lasting. The room was filled with the sound of the loom, the crackle of the fire, the steady hum of life outside. It was a sound that the weaver had heard all his life, a sound that brought him comfort, that made him feel connected to the world around him. He was not alone in his work. The village, the land, and the people were all with him, woven into the fabric of his life. And as the shuttle passed through the threads once more, the weaver thought of the stories yet to be woven, the lives yet to be touched by his craft. Each thread was a beginning, each pass of the shuttle a step forward in the long, unbroken line of history. The loom continued its steady rhythm, the fabric growing ever longer, and the weaver continued his work, adding his own story to the great tapestry of time. The sun had barely risen, and the weaver sat before his loom, the early light casting soft shadows across the floor of his cottage. The room was calm, filled only with the steady rhythm of his work, the shuttle passing through the warp threads, with a sound that echoed the heartbeat of the earth itself. Outside, the village was waking slowly, the sounds of everyday life creeping through the open window, the murmur of voices, the creaking of wooden carts rolling over cobblestone streets, the distant clatter of hooves, and the calls of birds greeting the dawn. The weaver had heard these sounds all his life, but today they felt different, almost as though the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. His hands moved with practiced ease, guiding the shuttle back and forth through the loom, his thoughts drifting like the soft breeze that rustled the leaves outside. Each thread he wove was part of a larger pattern, each pass of the shuttle a stitch in the fabric of the village's history. His mind wandered to the stories of old, tales passed down through generations, stories of the land and its people, of love and loss, of joy and sorrow. He thought of his ancestors, the weavers before him, their hands just as steady as his, their stories just as rich. They had lived simple lives bound to the land, and their craft had been the thread that connected them to the world around them. The weaver felt a deep sense of connection to them, as though their hands were guiding his own, just as they had guided the shuttle through the loom for centuries. As he wove, the patterns began to take shape, slow and deliberate, each line, each curve a part of a larger tapestry, a reflection of the rhythms of life in the village. The colors of the thread's earthy browns, rich greens, soft blues, and muted yellows blended together like the land itself, the forest, the fields, and the sky. Each color was chosen carefully, dyed from the plants, the roots, and the berries that grew in abundance around the village, a reflection of the world outside his window. The weaver paused for a moment, his hands still as he gazed out the window at the land beyond. The fields were bathed in the golden light of morning, the mist slowly lifting from the earth as the sun rose higher in the sky. The world outside was alive, vibrant, and full of possibility, and yet inside, the weaver found peace in the steady rhythm of his work. The loom was his anchor, the shuttle his guide, and the fabric he wove was the story of his life. As he resumed weaving, his mind returned to the village, to the people who would one day wear the cloth he created. He thought of the women who would wear the brightly colored shawls, the men who would wrap themselves in the sturdy, durable cloth, and the children who would run through the fields, their laughter echoing through the village. Each piece of cloth was a gift woven with love and care, meant to provide warmth and comfort, to protect those who wore it from the cold and the elements. The weaver's hands moved faster now, the shuttle passing through the threads with greater speed, but still, with the same precision. The patterns on the loom grew more intricate, more complex, as though the very fabric of the village was taking shape under his hands. He could almost see the lives of the people woven into the threads, the stories of their days, their joys, and their struggles. It was as though the loom was not just a tool, but a vessel for the history of the village, a place where the past and the present met and became one. Outside, the village continued to wake, the sounds of life becoming louder, more distinct. The weaver could hear the laughter of children in the distance, the murmur of conversation, the creaking of doors opening, the soft steps of neighbors going about their day. Life in the village was simple, but it was full of meaning, full of connections between the people, the land, and the work they did. The weaver's work was a part of that, a part of the ongoing story of the village, a story that had been told for generations and would continue long after he was gone. His fingers moved deftly over the threads, his mind quiet, focused only on the task at hand. The loom hummed softly in the stillness of the room, the only sound in the quiet morning. The world outside continued to stir, but for the weaver there was peace in the slow, steady rhythm of the loom, in the way the threads intertwined, the way the patterns emerged, the way the fabric grew longer and longer with each passing moment. He thought again of the stories of old, the ones his ancestors had woven into the fabric of their lives. They had worked in the same way, their hands moving slowly, carefully, with intention. They had lived by the rhythms of the land, by the changing of the seasons, and by the knowledge that their work was part of something larger than themselves. The weaver knew that his work was part of that same tradition, part of the same long line of weavers who had come before him. And as he wove, he felt connected to them, to the generations of weavers who had passed their craft down through the ages. The loom was a bridge, a link between the past and the present, and it was through this simple act of weaving that the weaver felt most connected to the world around him. The room grew warmer as the sun climbed higher in the sky, the light shifting as the day unfolded. The weaver paused again, wiping his brow, feeling the heat of the day beginning to settle over the land. The work was hard, but it was fulfilling, and he knew that he was creating something that would last, something that would be part of the village for generations to come. The shuttle moved back and forth. The loom creaked with every pass, and the fabric grew longer and longer. The weaver's work was a part of the village, a part of its rhythm, its history, and its future. As the day stretched on, the weaver continued. His work, his hands steady, his mind at peace, knowing that the fabric he was weaving was more than just cloth. It was the story of the village, the story of its people, woven into every thread. The loom hummed with the steady rhythm of the weaver's hands, each movement a part of a larger pattern, a reflection of the world outside. The sun had climbed higher, and its light now streamed through the small window, casting long shadows across the room. The weaver's eyes focused on the threads, his fingers weaving in and out, each motion deliberate, each pass of the shuttle precise. Outside, the village had come to life in full force, the sounds of daily activity filling the air, the laughter of children playing in the street, the clatter of carts moving along the cobblestones, and the soft murmur of neighbors chatting. As they went about their work, the weaver paused for a moment, letting the rhythm of the world outside mingle with the rhythm of his hands. It was in moments like this, when the work seemed to flow without effort, that he felt most connected to the world around him, as though each thread of the loom was linked to the very heartbeat of the village. His thoughts drifted to the people he wove for, the families that would wear the cloth, the men and women who would find warmth and comfort in his work. He thought of the stories they carried with them, the histories and memories woven into the fabric of their lives, just as the threads of the loom would one day carry the stories of his own life. It was a quiet realization, but one that filled him with purpose. Each piece of cloth was more than just a material object. It was a part of the story of the village, a tangible piece of history that would endure long after the weaver was gone. The loom creaked softly, its rhythm unchanged, as the weaver's hands continued their work, guiding the shuttle through the threads with practiced ease. His mind was calm, focused entirely on the task at hand. The threads before him shimmered. In the sunlight, their colors bright and vibrant, each one a piece of the world, carefully chosen to create something greater than the sum of its parts. The weaver thought of the land outside, the hills and valleys, the fields of wheat and rye that stretched to the horizon, the rivers that wound their way through the countryside, and the forests that stood tall and silent, full of life yet untouched by the hands of men. It was in these natural elements, the earth and the sky, the plants and animals, that he found inspiration for his craft. The colors he used, the rich browns of the earth, the greens of the trees and grasses, the soft blues of the sky, were all drawn from the world around him. The weaver knew that his work was a reflection of the land itself, a way to bring the outside world into the homes of the villagers, to carry a piece of nature's beauty into their daily lives. And yet, it was more than just beauty. The cloth he wove was practical. It provided warmth, comfort, and protection. It was a shield against the cold winds of winter, a barrier against the rain, and a comfort on the long journeys between villages. The weaver knew that his work had purpose, that it served a need in the village, and that made it all the more meaningful. His thoughts wandered to the families he had known throughout his life, the faces of the men and women who had passed through. His door, the laughter of children who had played in the streets. He thought of the festivals they celebrated, the songs they sang, the stories they told around the firelight. Each of these moments, he realized, was a part of the tapestry of life, a thread woven into the fabric of the village's history. Now, as he worked, he was adding his own thread to that tapestry. The shuttle moved faster now, the pace quickening as the weaver's hands grew more confident. The fabric was taking shape, each new section of cloth a reflection of his steady effort, of the hours he had spent at the loom, of the stories that had passed through his mind and his hands. He could feel the weight of the cloth building beneath. His fingers, its texture soft but strong, each thread a connection to the world around him. The weaver's thoughts turned to the future, to the generations yet to come, and he wondered who would inherit his loom when he was gone. Would his children carry on his craft, or would the village one day fall silent, the sound of the loom, replaced by the hum of machines? He did not know, but for now, it did not matter. For now, he had the loom, and with it, the ability to shape the world in his hands. The shuttle continued its steady passage, the rhythm never faltering. The weaver's mind, once filled with thoughts of the past and the future, was now entirely absorbed in the present. The threads before him shimmered in the sunlight, each one a promise of what was to come, each one a part of the greater whole. And as the sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting a golden glow over the room, the weaver knew that his work would not be finished for some time. But that was the beauty of it. The work was never truly done. The loom was always there, waiting, the shuttle always ready to glide through the threads, creating something new, something lasting, something that would carry the stories of the village forward long after the weaver was gone. The evening was falling, and the room was bathed in a soft, warm light as the weaver continued to work, his hands steady, his mind calm. Outside, the village settled into the quiet of the night, the sounds of daily life fading away, replaced by the soft murmurs of the wind and the distant calls of night creatures. But inside the cottage, the loom hummed on, its rhythm steady and unbroken. The weaver had found peace in his work, a peace that came not from the world outside, but from the steady, eternal rhythm of the loom, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing that each thread he wove added to the great tapestry of life. The day was slipping quietly into dusk, the sun's warm golden light spilling through the small window, casting long, soft shadows across the weaver's humble cottage. The loom, always a steadfast companion, creaked gently with each pull of wool. The shuttle, and the weaver's hands continued their careful dance, guiding the fibers through the warp with practiced ease. The rhythmic sound of the loom, the gentle rustling of the threads, seemed to blend seamlessly with the quiet murmur of life outside the cottage children's laughter echoing down the cobbled streets, the clatter of wooden carts rolling by, and the distant sounds of animals stirring in the evening. Yet inside, the weaver's world was centered entirely on the loom, its steady pulse the heartbeat of his thoughts. His mind wandered, though, as it often did when he was alone with his work. He thought of the threads that he wove, each one a delicate link in the larger pattern, each one a small but essential part of the whole. These threads, he realized, were much like the lives of the villagers outside, each person playing a role in the fabric of the community, each individual thread contributing to the larger story of the village. The weaver's life had always been intertwined with these other lives, just as the fibers he worked with were intertwined in the loom. He thought of his neighbors, people he had known for years, whose lives had intersected with his in ways both large and small. He had woven cloth for them, their families, their homes, each piece a small contribution to the larger tapestry of their lives. The connection between the weaver and his neighbors was invisible but profound, a bond that had been formed through years of quiet interaction and shared history. He thought of the many festivals they had celebrated together, the quiet evenings spent by the fire, the simple exchanges of goods and stories that marked the passage of time. In a way, it was the quiet, daily exchanges that mattered most, the things that went unnoticed, the things that made the fabric of life rich and complex. The weaver's fingers moved steadily, weaving a new pattern, a pattern that would soon find its place in someone's home, their life, their story. The loom, he thought, was like the community itself, a place where separate threads came together to create something stronger and more meaningful than any single thread could ever be on its own. His thoughts returned to the idea of connection, of how the threads of his life had been intertwined with those around him. It was not just his neighbors who had shaped him. The land itself had played a role. The fibers he worked with were spun from the wool of sheep that grazed on the hillsides beyond the village. These sheep, in turn, were nourished by the grasses and flowers that grew in the meadows, which in turn were shaped by the seasons, the weather, and the soil beneath their feet. Everything in the village, everything in the world was connected, bound together by unseen threads. The weaver could not escape this truth, not when he worked so closely with it. As his hands continued their task, his thoughts turned inward, and he reflected on his own place in the greater pattern of life. He was not just a craftsman. He was a part of something larger. Each piece of cloth he created was a small, humble contribution to the village, a stitch in the larger quilt of their shared existence. But it was a contribution that mattered. It mattered because it was woven with care, with attention to detail, with respect for the materials and the people who would one day use it. It mattered because it was a part of the ongoing story of the village, a story that had been unfolding for generations. And in that story, the weaver was just one thread, one small piece of the larger whole. But that, he realized, was enough. The evening was settling in now, the sun dipping lower in the sky, casting a soft, fading light over the cottage and the loom. The air had grown cooler, and the sounds of the village had softened as people returned to their homes for the night. Inside the cottage, the weaver's steady hands continued to guide the shuttle, the steady rhythm of the loom filling the room. It was a rhythm that he had come to rely on, a rhythm that gave him a sense of purpose, of connection. And yet, as the light faded and the room grew darker, he felt a quiet sense of peace wash over him. It was as though the world outside, with all its noise and movement, had been left behind for a while, and he had entered a place of stillness, a place where only the loom and his thoughts existed. The shuttle passed through the threads again, and again, the rhythm never faltering. It was a simple task, and yet it was one that carried with it a deep sense of meaning. The weaver thought of the generations of craftsmen who had come before, him who had worked in the same way, who had used the same tools, the same rhythms, the same processes. They too had woven cloth for their communities, for their families, for their homes. They had been a part of something larger, just as he was. The loom, in its simplicity, was timeless. And in that timelessness, the weaver found his place. The shuttle passed through the threads once more, and the weaver paused to admire the pattern that was emerging, a simple design, yet intricate in its own way. He smiled to himself, a quiet satisfaction settling over him. This was the work of his hands, the work of his life. And as the last rays of the sun disappeared, leaving the room in the soft glow of twilight, the weaver continued his task, knowing that with each movement, with each passing moment, he was weaving not just fabric, but the very fabric of life itself. The loom hummed, steady and unbroken, its rhythm a constant companion, a reminder of the invisible connections that bound him. To the world around him, the threads of life that wove the story of the village, and the quiet, enduring beauty of the work he did. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the small window of the weaver's cottage, the soft glow of early morning illuminated the quiet room, casting gentle shadows across the warm wooden floor and the sturdy loom that stood in the corner. The weaver, already awake, sat by the loom, his weathered hands resting for a moment on the cool surface of the wooden frame. The day ahead would be like any other, a continuation of the slow, deliberate rhythm of his work, the steady pull of the shuttle, the satisfying tension of the threads, the hum of the loom as it wove the story of the fabric that would become part of someone's life. But today, as the weaver prepared to begin his task, his mind wandered, reflecting on the passage of time and how it had shaped not only his work, but also his life. He thought of the countless hours he had spent here, weaving the simple yet essential cloth that wrapped his village in warmth and comfort, each piece of fabric a small contribution to the greater whole. The weaver had always found a sense of peace in his craft, a quiet satisfaction in knowing that his hands were creating something that would be used by someone, something that would last. But it was more than just the fabric itself that mattered. To him, it was the act of creation, the slow, steady process that connected him to the past, to those who had come before him, and to those who would come after. The loom, with its steady rhythm, was a constant reminder of the passage of time, the generations that had passed through this same small village, all weaving their own stories, their own threads into the fabric of life. As the weaver's hands moved toward the yarn, his thoughts turned to his own past, to the memories that had shaped him and his craft. He thought of his father, who had taught him the art of weaving when he was just a boy, his patient hands guiding him through the motions, showing him how to weave not just the fabric, but the very essence of life itself. His father had been A quiet, steady man, a man of few words, but the weaver had always understood the importance of his craft. He had learned early on that weaving was more than just a job. It was a way of life, a way of connecting with the world around him, a way of creating something lasting. The weaver's father had often spoken of the importance of tradition, of the unbroken chain of artisans who had come before them, each one passing down their knowledge, their skill, and their love of the craft to the next generation. It was a legacy, his father had said, that could never be broken, a link that stretched across time, connecting the past to the present, and the present to the future. And now, as the weaver sat before the loom, he felt that connection more strongly than ever. The shuttle glided smoothly through the threads, the soft rhythm of the loom filling the room. As the weaver's hands worked, the fabric began to take shape, slowly at first, then more quickly as the pattern emerged. It was a simple design, one that he had woven many times before, but today it felt different, as if the very act of weaving was somehow more meaningful, more connected to something greater than just the cloth he was creating. He thought of the people who would use the fabric, how it would wrap around them, providing warmth and comfort, how it would become a part of their lives in ways he could never fully understand. He thought of the families who would sleep beneath blankets made from the fabric he wove, the children who would wear shirts and dresses sewn from the same cloth, the homes that would be decorated with the simple yet beautiful patterns he created. It was a humbling thought to know that his work, though small in the grand scheme of the world, had such an impact. The weaver continued his work, his hands moving steadily, his mind lost in the rhythm of the loom, lost in the steady passage of time. And as he worked, he realized that in some ways, his craft had become a reflection of life itself. Just as the loom wove threads together to create something greater than the sum of its parts, so too did life weave the threads of experience, memory, and connection, creating a story that was greater than any single moment. The weaver's thoughts drifted back to his father, to the many lessons he had learned over the years, and to the way his father had always spoken of the future. His father had often said that the work they did, the craft they practiced, was a gift to the future, a way of ensuring that the tradition of weaving would continue long after they were gone. It was a way of leaving a mark on the world, of passing on something that would endure. The weaver's hands slowed as the fabric began to take shape, and for a moment he paused, reflecting on his father's words. The thought of the future, of the generations yet to come, filled him with a quiet sense of purpose. He knew that his work would not last forever, but the legacy of his craft, the tradition that had been passed down to him, would continue. And in that, he found peace. As the weaver continued his work, as sunlight outside the window shifted, casting a soft, warm glow over the room, the steady rhythm of the loom, the quiet hum of the shuttle, the gentle rustling of the threads, these were the sounds of life, of continuity, of connection. In the simple act of weaving, the weaver found meaning, and in that meaning, he found a deep and abiding peace. The day continued to unfold, the hours passing slowly as the weaver worked, the fabric growing beneath his hands, one thread at a time. The steady rhythm of the loom, the timeless dance of the shuttle, carried him through the day, carrying him deeper into the fabric of life, deeper into the connection that bound him to the world around him, to the past, to the future. Each piece of cloth he wove, each pattern that emerged, was a testament to the continuity of life, to the enduring legacy of those who had come before him, and to the hope that his own work would continue to shape the future in ways he could not yet imagine. And so, as the sun began to set, casting a golden light over the cottage and the loom, the weaver sat back and admired the fabric he had created, the simple, beautiful work of his hands, and he knew that, in some small way, he was a part of something much larger than himself, a part of the timeless rhythm of life itself. The weaver's hands, though steady and sure, seemed to feel the weight of history as they moved over the loom, pressing threads into place with the same deliberate care that had been passed down through generations. As the shuttle slid back and forth, weaving the fabric of the day, the quiet room seemed to come alive with echoes of those who had come before him. It was as if the loom itself hummed with the memory of their work, the slow and rhythmic pulse of their hands shaping the threads that made up the world. The weaver paused for a moment, allowing his fingers to trace the edges of the fabric, feeling the texture of the threads beneath his skin. He could almost hear the voices of his ancestors. Their soft murmurs carried on the breath of the past, guiding his movements as if they were still present, still watching over him. The room, though humble and small, seemed to hold the spirits of those who had woven before him, and with each passing moment, he felt the weight of their craft settle on his shoulders. It was a heavy responsibility, but it was one he had been born into, one that he had accepted without question, knowing that it was his duty to continue the work that had been started long before his time. The weaver's thoughts drifted back to his childhood, to the days when his father had taught him the art of weaving. He remembered the way his father's hands had moved over the loom, so steady, so practiced, each movement a reflection of years of dedication and experience. He could still see the faint traces of the same care in his own hands now, the way they moved instinctively, as though they had always known the rhythm of the loom. His father had never spoken much, but there had always been a quiet wisdom in the way he worked, in the way he passed on his knowledge without ever saying a word. It was a gift, one that the weaver had received without fully understanding its value at the time. But now, as his own hands moved over the loom, he realized just how deeply his father's lessons had shaped him. They were not just lessons in technique, in the art of weaving itself, but lessons in patience, in perseverance, and in the understanding that the work of the hands was a reflection of something deeper, a connection to the land, to the past, and to the future. The weaver's hands moved more swiftly now, the rhythm of the loom carrying him through the motions. The shuttle passed back and forth, and the fabric grew beneath his fingers, taking shape with each movement. He thought of the generations who had come before him, each one adding their own threads to the tapestry of life, each one contributing their own piece to the greater whole. The loom had been their constant companion, the tool that had bound them together across time, across generations. And now, as the weaver worked, he realized that he too was a part of that unbroken chain, a part of the fabric that stretched through the ages, connecting the past to the present, and the present to the future. Each thread, each stitch was a part of a larger story, a story that had been written long before he had been born and would continue long after he was gone. The sound of the shuttle, the creak of the loom, the quiet hum of the work, it was all part of the song of life, a song that had been sung for centuries and would continue to be sung for generations to come. The weaver felt a deep sense of peace. In that realization, a sense of belonging to something greater than himself. It was as if the work of his hands, the simple act of weaving, was a bridge between the past and the future, a way of connecting the lives of those who had gone before him with those who would come after. The fabric he wove was more than just cloth. It was the story of his people, the story of his family, the story of his ancestors. It was a history that could not be erased, a legacy that could not be forgotten. And in that moment, as the threads intertwined and the fabric took shape, the weaver understood the true meaning of his craft. It was not just about making cloth, it was about making a connection, about weaving together the strands of time, about ensuring that the story of his people would never be lost. The loom, with its steady rhythm, became a link between the past and the present, a way of honoring those who had come before and preserving their legacy for those who would come after. And as the weaver continued his work, he felt the weight of that responsibility settle on him, not as a burden, but as a privilege, a privilege to be a part of something that had endured for so long, something that would endure long after he was gone. The sun rose higher in the sky, casting a warm light over the cottage and the loom. The weaver's hands moved with a quiet grace, the shuttle gliding back and forth, weaving the fabric of the day. The sounds of the village beyond the cottage walls faded into the background as the weaver became lost in the rhythm of the loom, lost in the quiet hum of the work. He thought of his father, of the lessons he had taught him, and of the many years he had spent working beside him. He thought of the future, of the generations who would come after him, and he felt a deep sense of peace. The work would continue, as it always had, and as it always would. And in that moment, the weaver understood that his work was not just his own. It was part of something much larger, something that had been passed down through the ages, something that would continue long after he was gone. The loom, the shuttle, the threads, these were the tools that had connected him to his ancestors, and these would be the tools that connected him to the future. As the sun began to set, casting a golden light over the room, the weaver sat back and admired the fabric he had created. It was simple, yet beautiful, a testament to the quiet rhythm of his work, a reflection of the steady, unbroken chain of his ancestors. And as he gazed at the fabric, he knew that it was more than just cloth. It was a piece of history, a piece of his soul, woven into the fabric of time itself. As dusk settled over the village, the weaver's hands continued their steady rhythm, the loom before him acting as a silent conduit between the past and the present, its wooden frame creaking with the weight of generations. The twilight light filtered softly through the cottage window, casting long shadows across the room and illuminating the steady motion of his hands. He paused for a moment, letting the shuttle fall gently to the side as his mind wandered back to earlier days, spent with his father, learning the craft that had sustained their family for as long as memory allowed. Each moment spent beside his father, watching the deliberate motions of his hands as they wove intricate patterns, seemed to be etched into the weaver's own muscles. The steady, familiar rhythm of the loom was as much a part of him as his own heartbeat, and with every passing year, it felt as though the fabric of time itself was being woven through his very being. His father's teachings, though simple in words, were profound in their meaning. The weaver could still hear his father's voice, soft yet steady, as he spoke of the loom as not just a tool, but as a bridge that connected the village to the earth, to the seasons, and to the ancestors who had walked before them. The loom was a symbol of continuity, of life cycles, of the ongoing dance of creation that had been passed down through the ages, one thread at a time. As the weaver's fingers moved over the warped threads, the fabric beneath them grew, slowly, but surely, like a river carving its path through the land. The act of weaving, so simple yet so profound, was not just about creating a piece of cloth. It was about honoring the cycles of nature, the passage of time, and the lives of those who had come before. Every piece of fabric he wove carried with it the weight of his ancestors' hopes and dreams, their struggles and triumphs, their joys and sorrows. As the shuttle glided back and forth, weaving the threads into a coherent whole, the weaver felt the presence of those who had walked before him, his father, his grandfather, their fathers before them, each one of them contributing their hands, their hearts, to the creation of something lasting, something meaningful. The loom, the thread, the patterns that emerged, these were not mere objects of utility. They were the embodiment of history, the physical manifestation of lives lived, stories told, and futures built. He thought of the village beyond the cottage, walls of the people who moved in its streets, who tended its fields, who shared its burdens and joys. The rhythm of the loom, the rhythm of his hands, was their rhythm too. It was a song that had been passed down through generations, one that, was sung in silence, but felt deeply in the heart. He paused again, his thoughts drifting back to the present as he watched the fabric take shape before him. The colors of the wool, a soft cream, a deep red, a rich brown coming together in patterns that mirrored the earth itself, the fields, the hills, the sky. The weaver often wondered if the patterns he created on the loom were in some way a reflection of the world outside, the world that he knew so intimately, the hills he had climbed as a child, the fields he had worked beside, his father, the quiet rhythm of village life that had shaped his very soul. Perhaps the patterns were a language of sorts, a way of speaking without words, a way of connecting with the world around him in a way that was both personal and universal. As his hands continued their work, the weaver felt a deep sense of connection to those who had come before him, to the generations of weavers who had sat at looms much like his own, who had worked their craft with patience and dedication. Their hands had shaped the same threads, woven the same patterns, told the same stories. He could almost feel their presence beside him, their steady rhythm echoing in the quiet of the room, urging him forward, reminding him of his place in them all. Long line of weavers who had come before and would come after. The work was slow, but it was steady, and it was purposeful. Every movement of the shuttle, every pass of the thread, was a deliberate act, a small but meaningful contribution to the creation of something larger, something that would outlast him. The weaver had learned early on that weaving was not just about speed, about finishing the work quickly. It was about intention, about the quiet focus that came from knowing that every small act was part of a larger whole. Each piece of fabric he wove was a testament to that belief, a reflection of the care and attention that had been poured into it. As the light outside began to fade, the weaver's thoughts shifted again, this time to the future. His work was not just for him. It was for the next generation, for the children who would one day sit beside the loom, who would learn the rhythm of the shuttle, who would carry forward the legacy of those who had taught them. He thought of his own children, how they had watched him work as they grew, their small hands reaching out to touch the fabric he wove, their curious eyes following the movement of the shuttle. They were still young, but one day they would sit beside him, their hands working alongside his, learning the same lessons that had been passed down to him. He wondered what the world would be like for them, what kind of life they would lead, what kind of patterns they would create. But no matter what the future held, he knew that the loom would remain a constant, a symbol of continuity, of the ongoing cycle of life, of the weaving of time itself. The shuttle passed once more, and the weaver's hands moved with the same steady rhythm. The fabric grew beneath his fingers, each thread woven into place, each movement a small but significant part of something larger. And in that moment, as the loom creaked softly beneath him, the weaver felt the weight of history and the promise of the future, both pressing gently against his shoulders. The fabric of life, the fabric of time, was being woven, one thread at a time, and he was a part of that weaving, a part of that story, a story that would continue long after the shuttle had stopped, long after the loom had fallen silent, for the threads of time could never truly be unraveled. The first light of dawn crept across the horizon, spilling a soft golden glow over the weaver's modest cottage. The quiet hum of the world outside blended with the steady rhythm of his hands on the loom, the shuttle gliding back and forth with practiced ease. Each motion was as natural as breathing, as though the loom and the threads were an extension of his own body. The weaver's thoughts drifted like the steady pulse of the loom, carried on the currents of memory and time, to the lessons of his youth and the hands that had taught him the craft. His father's voice echoed in his mind, reminding him that weaving was not just about creating fabric, it was about creating connections, binding together not just threads, but lives, stories, and legacies. The loom had always been a silent witness to the passage of time, to the generations that had worked its rhythm and those yet to come. It was a symbol of continuity, of lives lived in the quiet, steady rhythm of daily tasks, where each moment, each action, wove the fabric of the future. With every passing year, the weaver felt more and more like a link in an unbroken chain, the threads of his own life intertwined with those of his ancestors. It was a feeling that had grown stronger with time, as if the loom itself was a living testament to the past, a bridge between what had been and what would be. The weaver's fingers moved with practiced grace, the fibers slipping through his hands like water through a riverbed. Each thread told a story, each pattern a piece of history, each movement a reflection of the seasons, the earth, and the people who had lived on it. The soft creak of the loom echoed through the cottage, mingling with the faint sound of the rekindled hearth fire crackling softly in the corner, and the weaver found himself lost in the rhythm of it all. The fabric was growing slowly, one pass of the shuttle at a time, its colors melding together like the earth's own palette of deep rust red, the color of the clay hills, the soft green of the meadows in spring, the muted yellow of the summer sun fading into autumn. As the threads came together, the weaver saw the world taking shape before him, not just in the patterns emerging in the cloth, but in the very way the fabric of life itself was woven. It was a task that required patience and care, but also something that went beyond skill or technique. It was an act of honoring the past while embracing the future, a delicate dance between memory and possibility. The weaver paused for a moment, his hands resting lightly on the loom as his thoughts wandered once again to his father. He could still remember the first time he had sat beside the loom, his young hands trembling with excitement as he watched his father weave. He had been so small then, barely able to reach the shuttle, but his father had guided him, his strong hands steady and sure, showing him the rhythm of the craft. Those early days had been filled with quiet moments of connection moments, when the world outside had seemed far away, when the loom had been the only thing that mattered. In those moments, the weaver had learned more than just how to make fabric. He had learned about the power of tradition, about the importance of preserving what was sacred, what was precious. The loom was not just a tool, it was a keeper of memories, a symbol of continuity. And through it, the weaver had come to understand that his own life was part of something larger, something that stretched beyond his own time and place. The steady rhythm of the loom had taught him patience, and the patterns that emerged had taught him about the delicate balance of life itself, how each thread, no matter how small, played a role in the greater design. He thought of his own children. Now, the little ones who had watched him work over the years, their curious eyes following the movements of his hands, their small fingers reaching out to touch the fabric as it took shape. He had taught them what he had learned, passing on the rhythm of the loom, the art of patience, and the importance of preserving what had been passed down to him. And though they were still young, he knew that one day they would sit at the loom, their hands working beside his, continuing the legacy that had been woven long before their time. The weaver's thoughts turned once again to the future. He wondered what kind of world his children would inherit, what stories they would tell, and what patterns they would weave. He could not predict the future, but he knew that the loom would continue, that the rhythms of life would go on, even after he was gone. The shuttle continued its steady path, the threads coming together as the fabric grew beneath the weaver's skilled hands. He felt the presence of his father beside him, guiding him even now, his teachings etched into every movement, every thread. And he knew that, just as his father had passed the loom down to him, he would one day pass it down to his own children. The loom would continue to weave, and with it, the stories of generations would continue to be told. As the light of the morning began to fill the cottage, the weaver's mind settled into a place of peace, his thoughts and hands moving in harmony with the world around him. The shuttle passed once more, the threads coming together, and the weaver smiled to himself, content in the knowledge that the work would never truly end. It was a work that would continue for as long as the loom stood, a work that stretched across generations, binding the past, the present, and the future together in the quiet rhythm of the weave. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a soft amber glow over the village, the weaver paused for a moment, his gaze drifting through the small window of his cottage toward the distant hills. The land stretched out before him, quiet and serene, bathed in the gentle light of dusk. The hills, once vibrant with the green of spring, had taken on a more somber hue as the earth prepared for the long sleep of winter. Yet, in this stillness, there was a sense of continuity, as if the land itself was whispering its timeless stories, woven into the very fabric of its existence. The loom before him, now half finished with the latest piece, seemed to hum with the same quiet energy, the rhythmic clicking of the shuttle, filling the room as it moved back and forth. It was a sound the weaver had grown accustomed to, a sound that echoed in the corners of his thoughts, reminding him of the years of work, the generations that had passed before him, and the quiet threads that connected them all. He thought of the silent watcher, the loom how it had stood in his family's home for as long as he could remember, its wooden frame worn smooth by the hands of those who had come before him. It was as much a part of the house as the hearth or the walls, a silent witness to the lives lived within, to the stories spun and woven into every thread. The loom had seen joy and sorrow, success and failure, births and deaths. It had stood through the changes of the seasons, the ebb and flow of time, its rhythm steady and unbroken. The weaver had always felt a deep connection to it, as if the loom itself held the memory of all that had come before. And yet, despite its age and the countless hands that had worked it, it seemed to remain unchanged, steadfast in its purpose. In its silence, it had become a keeper of memories, a silent guardian of the past. The weaver's thoughts drifted as his hands continued their work, the shuttle gliding smoothly between the taut threads. He wondered about the future, about the legacy that he would leave behind. The loom would remain, of course, its rhythm continuing as long as there were hands to guide it. But what of the stories it carried? What of the threads that bound the past to the present? Would they, too, remain, or would they fade with time, like so many forgotten whispers on the wind? It was a question that had haunted him for many years, a question that had no easy answer. He had taught his children the craft, as his father had taught him, but he could not predict how they would carry it forward. Would they, too, feel the same connection to the loom, the same pull of history that he had felt all his life? Or would they, like so many others, turn away from the quiet rhythms of the past, seeking something faster, something more immediate? The thought troubled him, but it was a concern he had long carried, one that he knew he could not solve. As the evening deepened and the shadows grew longer, the weaver worked in silence, his mind wandering through the labyrinth of time. The loom, with its steady rhythm, was a bridge between the past and the future, a silent watcher of the ebb and flow of life. It had witnessed the turning of generations, the passing of seasons, and the rise and fall of empires. In its own quiet way, it had recorded the history of his people, woven into the very fabric of the cloth it produced. Yet, for all its importance, it remained humble, a tool of the people, not of the rulers or the powerful. It was the heartbeat of the village, the pulse of a world that had long been forgotten by those who sought greatness and glory. But for the weaver, the loom was more than just a tool. It was a connection to something far older and deeper. It was the thread that linked him to his ancestors, to a world that had lived and died long before he was born. It was a reminder that, no matter how much the world changed, there were some things that remained constant, like the rhythm of the loom, like the cycles of the seasons, like the silent watcher in the corner of his cottage. The weaver's fingers slowed, the shuttle resting momentarily in his hands as he contemplated the loom's place in his life. In many ways, it had been a silent teacher, its lessons unfolding over time. Each thread, each pass of the shuttle, had taught him something new about patience, about endurance, about the delicate balance of life itself. It had shown him that, like the fabric he wove, life was made up of many small, seemingly insignificant moments, each one contributing to the whole. There were no grand gestures, no dramatic moments of change. Instead, there was only the quiet rhythm of daily life, the slow, steady passing of time, and the threads that connected it all. The weaver had come to understand that this was the true beauty of the loom. It was not in the finished piece, but in the process, the steady, unwavering rhythm that turned chaos into order, that transformed individual threads into something greater. The loom, in its silent way, taught him that life was not about the grand, sweeping gestures, but about the small moments that made up the whole. It was about the quiet, everyday rhythms that held everything together, just as the threads held the fabric together. The weaver smiled to himself as he picked up the shuttle once more, his hands moving with practiced ease. The quiet rhythm of the loom filled the room once again, its steady pulse like the heartbeat of the world. In its silence, it spoke to him, telling him that some things were meant to endure, that the threads of life would always find a way to weave together, no matter how far apart they seemed. And as the night deepened and the stars began to shine, the weaver knew that, in the end, it was the loom that would remain, a silent witness to the passing of time, to the stories of generations, and to the quiet beauty of the world that would continue to unfold thread by thread. As the sun rose higher in the sky, casting pale streaks of pink and orange across the horizon, the weaver stood at the doorway of his cottage, watching the village stir to life. The soft murmur of early risers filled the air, accompanied by the delicate clinking of tools being prepared for the day's work. Beyond the village, the hills stretched out, a tapestry of greens and browns, the trees still half covered in the fading mists of the morning. The weaver had always found comfort in these quiet moments before the world fully awakened. It was in these still early hours that he felt the most connected to the world around him, as though time slowed and the weight of the day had not yet descended. With a deep breath, he turned back toward the loom, its familiar shape awaiting him in the warm glow of the cottage. It stood there, a constant presence in his life, its wooden frame worn smooth from years of use. To the weaver, the loom was more than just a tool. It was an extension of himself, a way to speak without words, a means of translating the rhythms of life into something tangible. His hands moved instinctively, guiding the shuttle back and forth through the threads. The loom hummed softly in response, a steady, unbroken sound that brought with it a sense of calm. As the weaver worked, his thoughts wandered, as they often did, to the generations of weavers who had come before him. He wondered how much had changed since his ancestors first began their craft. Had they, too, found peace in the rhythmic sound of the loom, the quiet satisfaction of creating something with their hands? Or had they seen the same weight of time that now rested upon his shoulders, the ever-present sense of responsibility to continue the work, to pass the knowledge down to those who would come after? The weaver's mind drifted even further, to the passing of seasons, to the cycles of life that had always seemed so inevitable. Each year, the same patterns emerged. New crops were planted. The village celebrated its festivals. The cold of winter gave way to the warmth of spring. And then, inevitably, the year would end, only to begin again. Life was a series of endless cycles, and the loom, in its quiet rhythm, reflected this truth. It was in the weaving of threads that the weaver saw the delicate balance between beginnings and endings, between what was and what could be. Every strand was a part of something larger, a piece of the grand design that stretched beyond his understanding, yet which he felt in his very bones. As the day continued to unfold, the weaver's thoughts shifted to his own family. His children had grown, each carving their own path in the world, and yet the loom remained a constant in their lives, just as it had been for him. He thought of his eldest son, who had shown promise as a weaver from a young age. There was a time when the boy had worked beside him at the loom, his small hands clumsily attempting to mimic his father's movements. Those early days had been full of patience and laughter, and the weaver had taught him everything he knew. But as the years had passed, the boy had grown restless, his curiosity leading him toward other pursuits. The weaver had understood, of course. Life was a journey, and each person had to find their own way. Yet there was a part of him that wondered if his son would ever return to the loom, ever truly understand the deep connection between the rhythm of the craft and the rhythm of life itself. It was a thought that weighed heavily on his heart, though he kept it to himself. The loom, after all, was not just a tool for making cloth. It was a way of understanding the world. It was a means of embracing both the mundane and the profound, of creating something meaningful out of the ordinary threads of life. As the weaver continued his work, he began to feel a sense of peace, the steady rhythm of the shuttle in his hands grounding him in the present moment. It was a rare thing, this peace, and he cherished it whenever it came. The world outside may have been in constant motion, its complexities beyond his understanding, but here in his small cottage, with the loom as his anchor, he found a sense of stillness that allowed him to breathe deeply. He had spent much of his life working, not just at the loom, but in the service of others, always striving to make a difference, to contribute to something greater than himself. But now, as the years had passed, he had begun to realize that the most meaningful thing he could do was simply to be present, to create with his hands and his heart, to weave the story of his life into something tangible. The fabric he wove was not just for warmth or protection. It was a record of his existence, a testament to the moments that made up his days. With each pass of the shuttle, he was recording his thoughts, his feelings, his memories. The loom was his diary, his canvas, his way of leaving a legacy. He could not predict what the future held, nor could he control the paths his children would take. But he could continue the work, and in doing so, he could offer a piece of himself to the world. As the sun rose higher in the sky, the weaver found himself lost in the process, the rhythmic movement of the loom soothing his mind and soul. He no longer needed to think about the future, about what his children would do or what legacy he would leave behind. For now, there was only the loom, the threads, and the present moment. This, he realized, was enough. As the first rays of dawn filtered through the small window of the weaver's cottage, the world outside seemed still, as though holding its breath in anticipation of the day ahead. The morning was cool, and the air carried the familiar scent of dew on grass, mingling with the faint trace of wood smoke from the dying embers of the previous night's fire. Inside, the weaver's hands moved with practiced ease over the loom, the soft sound of the shuttle weaving its way through the threads, echoing in the quiet space. The loom, a constant companion in his life, seemed almost alive, responding to the movements of his hands with a soft creak, as though it too were settling into the rhythm of the day. Each thread, each pass of the shuttle, was a conversation, a dialogue between the weaver and the loom, a silent song that had been sung for generations, and one that would continue long after he was gone. The weaver had always found comfort in this rhythmic process, in the slow, methodical motion of the craft. It was a peaceful way to begin the day, to clear his mind of the noise of the world and focus solely on the task at hand. The world beyond the cottage walls might be bustling with the sounds of neighbors greeting one another, of children laughing and playing in the streets, but inside the quiet of his workshop, the weaver could lose himself entirely in the rhythm of his craft. As his hands worked, he thought about the years that had passed, the years spent weaving, the years spent raising his children, the years spent watching the village change around him. Time had a way of slipping by unnoticed, and the weaver sometimes felt as though he were standing still while the world moved on. His children, who had once sat beside him at the loom, had grown and gone their separate ways, pursuing their own dreams and passions. His eldest son, once so eager to learn the craft, had chosen a different path, one that led him far from the cottage, far from the loom. The weaver often thought of him, wondering if he ever missed the quiet rhythm of the loom, the way the shuttle moved back and forth, creating something tangible out of nothing. The weaver had always believed that the art of weaving was more than just a means of making cloth. It was a way of connecting with the past, with the generations that had come before, and with the future, the threads of life stretching out before him, waiting to be woven into something meaningful. It was a quiet, meditative act, a way of finding peace in the midst of chaos. The loom, like time itself, was patient, unwavering, and steady, always there, always waiting for the next pass of the shuttle, the next thread to be woven into the fabric. The weaver's thoughts wandered to the changes in the village, the way. The world outside his cottage had begun to shift. It was no longer as quiet as it once had been, the sounds of progress and change filling the air. New buildings were being constructed, new roads were being laid, and the rhythm of the village was changing, becoming faster, more hurried. The old ways, the ways of the loom, of the steady pace of life, were slowly being replaced by the rush of modernity. The weaver had seen it happen before, the way things changed, the way the old was replaced by the new. But even in the face of all this change, the loom remained a constant, a reminder of the simplicity and beauty of a slower, more deliberate pace of life. He often wondered if the world had forgotten how to appreciate the quiet moments, the moments that could be found in the slow, steady rhythm of the loom, in the sound of the shuttle moving through the threads. These were the moments that connected him to his ancestors, to the generations of weavers who had come before him, who had lived and worked in this very same cottage, who had created with their hands and passed down their knowledge from one generation to the next. The weaver knew that his craft was a part of something larger, something timeless. It was a way of preserving the past, of holding on to something that was slipping away. As he continued his work, his thoughts turned to the future, to the children and grandchildren who might one day inherit his loom, who might one day carry on the tradition of weaving. He wondered if they would appreciate it, if they would understand the quiet joy of working with their hands, of creating something from nothing. Or would they, too, be swept away by the tide of progress, too busy with the demands of the modern world to appreciate the quiet beauty of the loom? The thought troubled him, but he pushed it aside, focusing once again on the rhythm of the craft. The shuttle moved back and forth. The loom creaked in response, and the weaver lost himself once more in the steady beat of his work. Each pass of the shuttle was a promise, a connection to the past, to the future, and to the present. The fabric that emerged from the loom was more than just a piece of cloth. It was a story, a history, a piece of the weaver's soul woven into every thread. It was a legacy, something that would outlast him, something that would live on long after he was gone. The loom was his life's work, and as the sun rose higher in the sky, the weaver felt a deep sense of satisfaction, knowing that he was continuing the work of his ancestors, that he was contributing to something larger than himself. The world outside might change, but inside his cottage, in the quiet space where the loom stood, the rhythm of the craft would remain the same. It was a steady, unbroken song, and the weaver, for all his thoughts of change, knew that the loom would always be there, waiting, ready to weave the next story, the next piece of history. The sun was dipping below the horizon, casting its final golden rays across the landscape, while inside the weaver's cottage, the soft hum of the loom filled the air. The weaver, his hands worn and calloused from years of labor, continued his work with a quiet focus. The loom, now a familiar companion in his life, seemed almost to come alive under his touch, its steady creaks and groans in sync with the rhythm of his movements. Each thread that passed through his fingers was not just a piece of yarn, but a part of something larger, something timeless, a connection to the generations of weavers who had come before him. As his shuttle glided back and forth, the weaver's thoughts began to wander, as they often did during these quiet moments of solitude. He thought of his ancestors, the hands that had once worked this very loom, the hands that had woven the fabric of his family's history. What had they thought as they worked, he wondered. Had they too felt the weight of time, the sense that each piece of cloth they wove carried with it not just the patterns of the present, but the echoes of the past and the whispers of the future? He wondered how much they had known, or if, like him, they had simply worked because it was what they knew, what they had been taught, and what had been passed down from one generation to the next. The loom was a vessel of memory, he realized. It was not just a tool for creating fabric, but a medium through which stories were passed down, through the very act of weaving. Each pattern that appeared on the cloth was a reflection of the weaver's life, his experiences, his thoughts, his emotions. And as the weaver continued to work, he began to understand the true weight of the legacy he was carrying. His life, like the loom, was woven into the fabric of time, each moment building upon the last, creating a tapestry of his own making. But what would become of that legacy when he was gone? Would the loom, with all its history and stories, be forgotten? Would the younger generations, who seemed more interested in the bustle of modern life than the quiet rhythms of the loom, understand its significance? The weaver had watched, with a heavy heart, as his children had grown and moved away, their lives pulling them in different directions. His eldest son, once so eager to learn the craft, had long since left, his dreams leading him far from the cottage, far from the loom. The weaver had tried not to take it personally, understanding that his son had his own path to follow, but it was hard not to feel a pang of loss. The loom, once a bridge between father and son, now stood silent in the corner of the room, a reminder of what had been and what might never be again. The weaver's youngest daughter, too, had shown little interest in the craft. She was more fascinated by the world beyond the village, eager to explore the unknown, to chase dreams that were not bound by the rhythm of the loom. And so, the weaver was left with his thoughts and his work, the loom his only constant companion. But even in the face of these changes, the weaver knew that the loom had a purpose beyond his own lifetime. It was not just a relic of the past, but a bridge to the future, a way of preserving the stories of those who had come before and passing them on to those who would come after. Perhaps his children would not be the ones to carry on the craft, but someone would eventually. The legacy of the loom would not die with him. It was too deeply woven into the fabric of his family's history for that. It would live on, perhaps in unexpected ways, passed down through the generations as an inheritance of knowledge and tradition. And if the loom was forgotten by the world, if the rhythms of the craft faded away, it would remain here in the quiet of this cottage, a testament to the enduring strength of memory and the unbroken thread of legacy. The weaver's thoughts returned to the present as he adjusted the tension on the loom, his hands moving with practiced precision. The fabric he was creating was nearly finished, and he could already see the patterns emerging, each one a reflection of the life he had lived. The soft hues of the cloth seemed to capture the very essence of his world, the gentle greens of the hills outside, the warm browns of the earth, the deep blues of the evening sky. It was a tapestry of memories, a record of his life's work. He could almost hear the whispers of his ancestors in the rustling of the threads, the voices of those who had sat at this same loom, weaving their own stories. And as he worked, he realized that he, too, was weaving the story of his life, one thread at a time. The fabric would outlast him, just as the loom had outlasted those who had come before him. It would carry his story, his legacy, long after. He was gone, and perhaps, in time, it would find its way into the hands of someone new, someone who would understand the quiet power of the loom and the stories it held. The weaver finished his work with a final, satisfied movement, the last thread passing through the loom. He stood for a moment, admiring the fabric before him. It was not just a piece of cloth, but a reflection of his life, his legacy, and the quiet rhythm of the loom that had been his constant companion. As the evening light faded, the weaver knew that he had done his part, that the loom had once again fulfilled its purpose. And in that quiet satisfaction, he found peace, knowing that the stories of his life, woven into the fabric of time, would continue long after he was gone. The first light of dawn stretched across the horizon, casting a soft glow on the cobblestone streets of the village as the weaver sat before his loom, his mind a whirl of thoughts and reflections. The loom, its worn wood smooth beneath his hands, seemed to hum with the silent knowledge of centuries, a timeless witness to the ebb and flow of life. Each movement of the shuttle, each pass of the thread, felt like a step through history itself. A quiet journey that began long before the weaver was born, weaving the fabric of time with care and precision. His fingers danced across the threads, each one a story, each one carrying the weight of lives lived and lives yet to be lived. The loom was not just a tool for weaving cloth, but a vessel of memory, holding the echoes of those who had come before, him and who would come after. As the shuttle moved back and forth, the weaver felt the weight of those memories, the knowledge that he, too, was part of this long, continuous thread. His thoughts drifted to the generations that had come before him, their hands steady and sure as they wove the stories of their lives into the fabric of their time. What had they thought as they worked? He wondered. Had they, too, felt the presence of the past, the weight of those who had shaped their world? And what would his children, or their children, think of him when they looked upon the cloth he was creating? Would they see the same thread of history woven through the patterns of his work? Would they recognize the quiet strength of the loom, the subtle wisdom of those who had lived their lives in the same rhythmic pattern, day after day, year after year? The weaver paused for a moment, his hands resting on the loom as he considered these thoughts. It had been a lifetime of weaving, a lifetime of creating something that would outlast him, something that would carry his name and his story long after he was gone. But even as he worked, he knew that the loom would not be remembered just for the cloth it had helped create. It would be remembered for the stories it held, for the quiet moments of reflection it had inspired, for the connections it had forged between generations. Each piece of fabric, each piece of cloth, was a record of a life lived, a testament to the endurance of the human spirit and the quiet power of memory. And in that moment, the weaver realized that his work was not just about creating something beautiful, but about preserving something vital, the stories of his ancestors, his family, his village, and the world they had shaped together. The loom was a bridge between the past and the future, a tool that allowed him to connect with the generations before him and those that would come after. And in that quiet, steady rhythm of weaving, he felt a sense of peace, knowing that he was part of something much larger than himself. As the day unfolded, the weaver continued his work, the shuttle moving back and forth in a steady, rhythmic pattern. The fabric he was creating was a tapestry of time, a record of the seasons, of the cycles of life, of the joys and sorrows that marked each passing year. And as the cloth took shape, so too did his understanding of his place in the world, his role in the ongoing story of life. With each pass of the shuttle, each thread woven into the fabric, he felt a deeper connection to the past, to those who had lived before him, and to those who would come after. The loom was not just a tool for creating something physical. It was a tool for connecting the intangible threads of memory, history, and legacy. As he worked, the weaver felt the presence of those who had come before him, his ancestors, his teachers, the countless hands that had touched this very loom before him. He felt their wisdom in the steady rhythm of the shuttle, in the way the threads aligned perfectly, in the way the fabric unfolded with such quiet grace. And as the day wore on, the weaver found himself lost in the quiet contemplation of his work, each moment of the day blending into the next, as though time itself had slowed, allowing him to savor each passing second. The loom had become more than just a tool. It had become a symbol of continuity, of the unbroken thread of life that stretched back into the past and reached forward into the future. And with each piece of fabric he wove, the weaver felt that he was adding to that thread, contributing his own small part to the larger tapestry of time. As the sun began to set and the evening light filled the room with a warm, golden glow, the weaver paused to admire his work. The fabric lay before him, a testament to his years of dedication, his quiet labor, his connection to the generations that had come before. He knew that the cloth he had created would eventually find its way into the hands of others, woven into the lives of those who would carry on the tradition of the loom. Perhaps one day, when the world had changed, when the rhythm of weaving had faded into memory, someone would find this cloth, perhaps in an attic or in a forgotten chest, and wonder about the hands that had created it. They would wonder about the weaver, about his life, about the stories that had been woven into the fabric. And in that moment, the weaver knew that his work would not be forgotten. The loom, with all its quiet power and enduring strength, would continue to connect the past and the future, weaving the stories of those who had lived and those who would come after. The weaver stood and stretched, his body aching from the long hours of work, but his heart full of quiet satisfaction. He had done his part, woven his story into the fabric of time, and he knew that, in the end, that was all that mattered. The loom had given him a sense of purpose, a connection to the past, and a legacy to pass on to those who would come after him. And as he walked to the hearth, the fire crackling softly in the corner, he knew that the tapestry of life would continue, woven by the hands of those who had come before and those who would come after. The first rays of morning light pierced the stillness of the weaver's cottage, spilling softly through the small window and illuminating the warm wooden floors. The room, as familiar to the weaver as his own hands, was filled with the comforting scent of wool, the faint smoke of last night's hearth fire lingering in the air. The loom stood silently in the corner, its wooden frame rich with the history of 1,000 threads woven through its sturdy beams, each strand carrying with it a story of labor, of tradition, and of the passage of time. The weaver's fingers brushed the cool, smooth surface of the loom as he prepared for another day of work, his movements slow and deliberate, each action steeped in the knowledge of years spent weaving the fabric of his life. Each thread, each pattern was a reflection of his memories, his experiences, the quiet rhythms of a life lived in harmony with the land and the seasons. The shuttle passed through the warp, the movement of the loom almost meditative, as though the very act of weaving carried him back to those early years of apprenticeship, when his hands had first learned the dance of the loom, guided by the patient hands of his father. It was a memory that surfaced each time his fingers touched the threads, the quiet voice of his father urging him to weave with care, to listen to the rhythm of the loom, to feel the pulse of the fabric beneath his fingertips. The lessons his father had taught him were woven into the very fabric of his being, and though his father had long since passed, it was as if he were still there, a presence in the loom, a presence in the threads. The weaver paused for a moment. His eyes closed as he allowed the memories to wash over him. He thought of his father's calloused hands, the quiet strength in his voice, the way he had worked tirelessly, day after day, creating beautiful tapestries that had warmed the home and clothed the family. His father's work had always been more than just labor. It had been an expression of love, a gift passed down from one generation to the next. And now, the weaver was the one carrying that legacy forward, continuing the work that had been started long before he was born. With each movement of the loom, he felt that connection to the past, to his father, and to the generations of weavers who had come before him. The loom was more than just a tool for creating cloth. It was a bridge between past and present, a vessel that held the stories of all those who had touched it. As the shuttle continued its steady back-and-forth motion, the weaver's thoughts turned to his own children. His eldest son had left the village many years ago, seeking his fortune in the city, far from the peaceful rhythms of village life. The weaver had tried to pass on the craft to him, had hoped that one day his son would take up the loom and continue the family tradition. But the boy had never shown much interest. Instead, he had longed for something different, something more modern, something that didn't require the slow, deliberate pace of the loom. His daughter, too, had shown little interest in the craft, preferring to explore the world beyond the village to seek her own path. The weaver had always understood, in a way, that the loom might not be passed down to his own children. He had accepted that the world was changing, that the rhythm of life was shifting, and that the loom might one day be forgotten. But even so, there was a quiet sadness in his heart when he thought of the generations that might never know the quiet joy of weaving, the way the loom connected them to the past, the way it offered a sense of peace in a world that seemed to be moving faster and faster with each passing year. The fabric he wove was not just a product. It was a reflection of life itself, a record of the slow, steady passage of time. Each thread, each pattern, was a reminder that life, in all its complexities and challenges, was ultimately about continuity. It was about carrying forward the lessons of the past, about honoring the work of those who had come before, and about creating something beautiful that would endure beyond the weaver's own time. The weaver's thoughts were interrupted by a soft creaking sound. The loom was shifting, the tension on the threads tightening as the fabric slowly took shape. It was a sound that had become familiar to him, a sound that marked the steady progress of his work. The patterns on the cloth began to emerge, intricate and delicate, each design a reflection of his life and his memories. The cloth was more than just fabric. It was a tapestry of his existence, a chronicle of his days spent working the loom, of the seasons that had come and gone, of the joys and sorrows that had marked his life. As the shuttle moved back and forth, the weaver felt a deep sense of fulfillment. He knew that, even if his children did not choose to continue the craft, the work he had done would remain, a testament to the quiet strength of tradition and the enduring power of memory. The loom, like the fabric it created, would endure long. After he was gone, it would continue to tell the stories of his life, of his father's life, and of the lives of all those who had worked it before. The weaver's hands moved with practiced grace, the rhythm of the loom becoming a meditation, a prayer of sorts. Each pass of the shuttle was an affirmation of his place in the world, of his connection to the past, and of his responsibility to continue the work that had been handed down to him. The fabric he created was not just for him. It was for the future, for the generations that would come after, whether they understood it or not. The work of the loom was a legacy, one that transcended the individual, one that was passed down through the generations, like the threads that ran through the fabric. And as the weaver finished his day's work, he stood for a moment, taking in the beauty of the fabric before him. It was not yet complete, but it was close. He knew that with each passing day, he was getting closer to finishing it, to creating something that would outlast him, something that would live on in the threads, in the patterns, and in the memory of those who would come after. The loom had given him a purpose, a sense of continuity, and a connection to the past that he could not find anywhere else. And as the evening light faded, the weaver knew that he was part of something much larger than himself, a legacy of love, labor, and tradition that would continue to be woven into the fabric of time, one thread at a time. As the sun began its descent behind the distant hills, casting long, soft shadows across the village, the weaver's hands continued their work, the rhythmic motion of the loom steady and familiar. Each thread, each pass of the shuttle seemed to weave not just fabric, but the very essence of his life, his memories, and the timeless bond between past, present, and future. The weaver had long ago learned to embrace the steady, unwavering pulse of the loom, where each movement echoed the cycles of the earth, the seasons, and the ever-changing passage of time. He paused for a moment, gazing at the cloth that was slowly taking shape beneath his hands. It was more than just a tapestry. It was a map of his soul, a reflection of his life's journey, and the story of the land that had given him everything. The patterns that emerged were not random, but formed from a language known only to those who understood the quiet power of the loom, a language of memories, of whispers carried on the wind, and of stories passed down through the generations. The weaver's mind drifted back to his childhood, to the days when his father had sat at this very loom, his own hands working with the same steady grace, creating fabric that would clothe the family, warm the home, and serve as a reminder of the enduring strength of tradition. The weaver could still hear his father's voice, calm and reassuring, as he had taught him the art of weaving, each lesson imparted with patience and care. It was a gift his father had passed on to him, and, in turn, it had become a gift that he now passed on to his children, though they had shown little interest in the craft. The weaver could not help but feel a sense of loss, knowing that the loom, this quiet keeper of history and tradition, might not find a new generation to carry it forward. His eldest son had left many years ago, seeking a life outside the village, outside the slow rhythms of the loom and the land. His daughter, too, had her own dreams, far removed from the threads that had once connected generations. It was a thought that weighed heavily on the weaver's heart, but he also understood. The world was changing, and the loom, with its ancient rhythms, could no longer hold the same place in the hearts of those who had grown up in an age of speed, of machines, and of constant motion. Yet, even in this, the weaver found peace. For what he wove was not just cloth. It was memory, and memory was timeless. No matter what the future held, no matter how far the world moved away from the old ways, the tapestries he created would remain. They would carry the stories of his life, of his father's life, and of all those who had touched the loom before him. The weaver smiled softly to himself, the sound of the shuttle's steady rhythm filling the silence of the room, his thoughts returning to the present. The fabric before him was near completion, and with it, a sense of fulfillment settled deep within his bones. It was a labor of love, a labor of continuity, and in the weaving of the cloth, the weaver felt the passage of time itself. As though he were stitching the very fabric of his existence, into something greater than himself. The loom, in its quiet strength, had become the weaver's constant companion, its unspoken language a source of comfort and solace in times of joy and sorrow alike. The weaver's hands moved with practiced grace, weaving the final strands into the cloth, each pass of the shuttle bringing the fabric closer to its completion. As the light outside waned and the first stars began to twinkle in the evening sky, the weaver laid the shuttle down and stood up, his body weary but content. The tapestry before him was finished, and with it he felt a deep sense of accomplishment. It was not just a piece of cloth. It was the culmination of years of work, of tradition, and of love. It was a reflection of all that had come before him, and a tribute to the generations yet to come. As he ran his fingers over the finished fabric, the weaver thought of his father, of the long days spent at the loom, of the quiet moments shared in the soft glow of the hearth fire, and of the deep sense of purpose that the loom had given him. The tapestry was more than just a physical object. It was a living thing, a testament to the enduring strength of the craft, and a reminder that, even as the world around them changed, the threads of the past would always remain, woven into the fabric of time. The weaver stepped back and looked at the tapestry one last time, a sense of gratitude filling his heart. In that moment, he knew that his work had not been in vain. The loom had carried him through the years, through the seasons, and through the ebb and flow of life itself. It had connected him to his ancestors, to the land, and to the rhythm of the earth. And now it would stand as a reminder of all that had come before and all that would come after. With a final contented sigh, the weaver turned away from the loom and walked to the door. The night had fallen, and the village was quiet, save for the soft murmurs of the wind rustling through the trees. As he stepped outside, the weaver looked up at the sky, where the stars shone brightly, a testament to the vastness of the world and the quiet beauty of the night. He felt a deep sense of peace settle within him, knowing that the work of the loom would continue, even if the world around him did not. It was a work that transcended time, a work that would always remain, woven into the fabric of history, passed down through the generations, and carried forward in the hearts of those who understood its quiet power. And as the weaver stood there, gazing up at the stars, he knew that the loom had given him something more than just fabric. It had given him a legacy that would endure, long after the threads had been woven into the cloth. The morning mist hung low over the village, wrapping everything in a soft, silvery veil as the first rays of dawn gently pierced through, casting a golden glow on the dew-covered grass. The weaver stood at his loom once again, the familiar, comforting rhythm of the shuttle guiding his hands. The loom was more than a mere tool. It was an extension of his very being, a living connection to the past and the future, to everything he had ever known. Each thread was a piece of his life, woven with care, imbued with meaning, and given purpose through the steady rhythm of his work. As he began weaving, the memories of those who had come before him came flooding back. His father's hands, worn and calloused from years of labor, had once guided his own, teaching him the sacred art of weaving. Those lessons were etched into his memory, a legacy passed down through generations, each weaver before him adding their own unique mark to the fabric of history. He could almost hear his father's voice in his mind, speaking of the importance of patience, of honoring the loom, of knowing that each piece of fabric created was not just for warmth or beauty, but for something far more profound. It was a link in a chain, a part of a larger tapestry, one that spanned time and space, uniting all those who had ever touched the loom. As his hands moved, the weaver thought about his own children, wondering if they would one day take up the loom in their turn. He had always hoped that one of them would carry on the craft, continue the tradition, but as the years had passed, he had begun to realize that the world was changing. His son, the eldest, had long since left the village, seeking his fortune. In the city, far removed from the slow, steady rhythm of life at the loom. His daughter, too, had found her own path, one that didn't involve the loom or the village. The weaver couldn't blame them. The world was different now, and the quiet simplicity of village life was no longer the path that many young people wanted to take. Still, a part of him felt the weight of that unspoken loss. The loom would not be passed on in the same way it had been passed down through generations. But the weaver also understood that this was the natural course of things. Change was inevitable, and while it might be difficult to accept, it was part of the cycle of life. He had done his part, had honored the loom and the tradition as best as he could. He had woven the stories of his ancestors into each thread, and now it was time for the world to change. As the weaver's hands moved steadily, he found himself thinking not of his children, but of the many people whose lives had been touched by the fabric he had created. Over the years, his work had traveled far beyond the walls of his humble cottage, finding its way into the hands of traders, merchants, and travelers who passed through the village. His tapestries had clothed strangers in distant lands, kept them warm during long winters, and provided them with a piece of the earth he called home. In that way, the weaver had unknowingly shared his village with the world, each piece of fabric carrying with it a piece of his heart, his history, and his love for the land. He took comfort in the thought that his work, though it might not continue in the same form, had touched lives in ways he could never have imagined. And that, he thought, was enough. His mind wandered again to the loom before him, to the steady pulse of the shuttle and the rhythmic motion of his hands. With each pass of the shuttle, he felt more and more at peace, as though the very fabric of time itself was being woven, each thread connecting past and future, each movement a testament to the enduring power of tradition. The loom was more than just a tool. It was a vessel for memories, for stories, for the very essence of life itself. The weaver's thoughts turned inward as he worked, contemplating the meaning of his life, his work, and the legacy he would leave behind. It was a quiet, humble life filled with simple joys and slow rhythms, but it had been a life well lived. He had not sought fame or fortune, but rather had dedicated himself to the craft, to the loom, and to the people of his village. He had given his life to something greater than himself, something that transcended time and place. And in that, he had found a deep, abiding fulfillment. His work had meaning, and that meaning would continue long after he was gone. The weaver continued to work, the shuttle moving back and forth with practiced ease, each movement a prayer, each thread a blessing. He felt a deep connection to the loom, as though it were an extension of himself, a reflection of his soul. It had been there for him in moments of joy and sorrow, in times of peace and strife, and it would continue to be there long after he was gone. The loom, he realized, was not just a tool. It was a part of him, a part of his legacy, and it would live on in the fabric he created, in the stories woven into every thread. As the light began to fade and the shadows lengthened, the weaver finished his work for the day. The tapestry before him was nearly complete, its intricate patterns and designs a testament to the hours of labor he had invested. He looked at it for a long moment, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction. It was, he thought, a beautiful piece of work, one that would stand the test of time, just as the loom had. And though he knew that his children might not carry on the craft, he found comfort in the knowledge that his work, his legacy, would live on. The fabric would endure, woven into the fabric of the world, carrying with it the memories of those who had come before and those who would come after. The weaver stood up from his loom and stretched, feeling the ache in his muscles from a long day of work. He walked to the window and looked out at the village, the last light of the day fading into the horizon. The world was changing, but for now, in this quiet moment, everything felt right. The loom had carried him through the years, and in return, he had woven the very essence of his life into every piece of fabric he created. And that, he thought, was the greatest gift he could give. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the land, the weaver stood in his cottage, the soft hum of the evening settling over the village like a blanket. The loom, its wooden frame weathered by years of use, stood before him, waiting as always, its threads stretched taut, ready to carry the weight of yet another day's work. It was during these quiet moments, when the world around him seemed to slow, that the weaver found his deepest reflections. The fading light of day seemed to draw him inward, into thoughts of his past, his work, and the legacy he would leave behind. Each time he sat before the loom, each time he passed the shuttle through the threads, he was reminded of how deeply he was intertwined with the craft, how much of himself he had poured into each piece of fabric. It was more than a job. It was his life's work, a slow, rhythmic dance of creation and memory. The weaver could feel the weight of his ancestors in the loom, as though their hands, too, had once woven the very threads he now held. It was a humbling thought, how much had been passed down, how many generations had sat in this very spot, their own hands moving with the same steady rhythm, creating something that would endure far beyond their lifetimes. The loom had been passed down to him, and in turn he would pass it on to someone else, though he wasn't sure. His children, grown and gone, had chosen their own paths, and though he had hoped one of them would continue the work, it was becoming clearer that the tradition would not continue in the same way. And yet, even in that uncertainty, the weaver found peace. The loom had never been about legacy, at least not in the sense of fame or recognition. It had always been about the work itself, about the slow, deliberate process of creation. As his hands moved across the loom, he thought about the generations that had come before him, the weavers whose lives had been marked by the same steady rhythm of work and creation. They had lived, they had woven, and now their work lived on in him, in the very fabric he created. It was a humbling realization that he, too, was part of a cycle that stretched far beyond his own life. The loom was not just a tool. It was a vessel, carrying the stories and memories of countless generations. The weaver's thoughts turned to the future, to the world beyond his cottage. The village was changing. The sounds of the old world, the creak of wooden wheels on cobblestone streets, the steady hum of daily life, the quiet laughter of children playing, were giving way to a new rhythm. The modern world was creeping in, bringing with it new ways of living, new technologies, new possibilities. And yet, there was something timeless about the work of the loom, something that resisted the rush of progress. The weaver knew that the world would continue to change, but the loom would always have a place in it, if only in the quiet corners of the world where people still valued the slow, steady rhythm of creation. The shuttle passed through the threads again, its soft sound filling the room, and the weaver felt a sense of calm wash over him. There was something deeply comforting about the work, about the steady rhythm that had carried him through so much. In life, he thought about the struggles he had faced, the hardships of his youth, the loss of loved ones, the years of hard work that had sometimes felt like they would never end, and yet here he was, still weaving, still creating. It was a reminder that, no matter what changes the world brought, the act of creation was something that could never be taken away. The loom had always been there for him, and it would continue to be, as long as he could still sit before it, as long as his hands could still move in that familiar rhythm. The weaver paused for a moment, his hands resting on the loom, and he allowed himself to simply be. The world outside his cottage was quiet, the sky deepening into twilight, And in that silence, he felt the weight of all that had come before him and all that was yet to come. It was a humbling thought that the loom, the very thing that had defined his life, was part of something much bigger than himself. The threads of time stretched back into the past, and they would stretch forward into the future, carrying with them the memories of all who had come before and all who would come after. The weaver's role in that story was small, perhaps, but it was no less important. He was part of the fabric of history, just as the threads he wove were part of the tapestry of life. Slowly, the weaver stood up from his loom, stretching his tired muscles as the last light of the day faded into darkness. The work for the day was done, and tomorrow he would return to the loom to continue the cycle of creation. There was something reassuring in that thought that the work would never truly end. As long as there was a loom, there would be something to create, something to weave. And even if the world changed around him, the rhythm of the loom would remain constant, a steady pulse in a world that often seemed chaotic and unpredictable. The weaver stepped outside, taking in the cool evening air, and he looked up at the stars beginning to appear in the sky. The world was vast, and yet, in that moment, he felt a deep connection to it. The loom, the village, the stars all were part of the same intricate pattern, a tapestry of life that stretched across time and space. And though he knew that his time on this earth was limited, he took comfort in the knowledge that the loom would continue, that the work of creation would carry on, long after he was gone. With that thought in his heart, the weaver returned to his cottage, ready to face another day, knowing that each moment of creation was a step in the never-ending cycle of time. As dawn's first light filtered through the thin wooden shutters, the weaver rose from his slumber, stretching his weary limbs, feeling the warmth of the hearth still lingering in the room from the night before. The soft crackle of embers whispered, as a reminder of the fire's life, the warmth it brought, and the stories it held within its flickering light. He glanced over to the loom, now sitting silently in the corner, waiting patiently for his touch. Today would be another day of weaving, but it would be different, for the weaver felt a sense of weight in his chest, as though something had shifted in the air, something deeper than the day's simple tasks. As his hands brushed against the woolen threads, he could almost hear the echoes of his ancestors, those who had sat at looms just like this one, creating fabrics that told the stories of their lives. These hands, his hands, were now part of that endless, timeless cycle. The loom itself was not just a tool. It was a vessel of history, holding the strength of countless generations who had labored over it. Each movement, each thread woven through the warp and weft, was a connection to all who had come before him. The work of the loom was never just about creating fabric. It was about creating a link, a thread connecting the past to the present to the future. It was as if each strand of thread held within it the knowledge, the dreams, the hardships, and the joys of those who had crafted before him. The weaver often found himself lost in these thoughts, as he sat in front of the loom, the rhythm of his movements carrying him to a place beyond the mundane, to a space where time seemed to stand still. Today, as his hands moved across the threads, the air felt thicker, almost as though the loom itself was speaking to him. The stories of the past were swirling around him, urging him to listen more closely, to understand that what he was doing now had weight, that it was more than just fabric being created. It was history in the making. The weaver paused for a moment, letting the shuttle hang in mid-air, his fingers lightly grazing the delicate threads. For years he had worked alone, feeling the solitude of his craft, but today he realized something profound. Though he had no one to pass his loom to, no one who would take his place at this humble cottage to continue the craft, there was a certain peace in knowing that the stories of the past were woven into every strand he crafted. The loom, even, if it were abandoned after him, would carry on its silent duty of connecting generations. The knowledge of his craft would live in the fabric he had made, even if no one ever saw it again. The weaver's heart felt a tug, a bittersweet feeling of recognition. His children had chosen their own paths, far from the loom, from the humble life of weaving. They had found their futures in a world that was quickly changing, a world that did not seem to have room for the quiet, steadfast rhythm of the loom. But that was all right. He realized now that it wasn't about leaving a legacy through direct heirs or successors. The legacy was in the work itself, in the process. Every piece he had ever woven carried with it a small part of him, a whisper of his life. The loom was a memory in itself, a keeper of stories, just as much as he was. His thoughts wandered as he continued his work. The morning light grew brighter. The village outside stirred with the sounds of daily life, the soft murmur of neighbors, exchanging greetings, the clattering of carts over cobblestones, the distant lowing of cattle. The world was alive, but in the quiet of his cottage, the weaver felt detached from the noise. There was peace in that detachment, a serenity in the knowledge that he had his craft, his loom, his place in the world, no matter how small. The loom's steady rhythm, the motion of the shuttle gliding back and forth, was his meditation, his connection to something greater. The weaver's mind returned to the idea of generations. Time, he realized, was not a straight line. It was cyclical, like the rhythm of his weaving. Each person who lived, each person who labored, was simply a thread in the greater fabric of life. It wasn't about being remembered. It was about being part of the ongoing creation, the never-ending weave of time. His work, though seemingly insignificant in the vastness of history, was still part of that greater pattern. The shuttle slid across the loom once more, the sound gentle and rhythmic, and the weaver felt a profound sense of gratitude. The threads he wove today would not only create a piece of fabric, but would also carry his thoughts, his essence, into the future. The loom was his legacy, not in the material sense, but in the way it carried the spirit of creation, of continuity, of life itself. He thought of the many hands that had come before him, their movements like his own, each generation contributing to the tapestry of the world. The past was never truly gone. It lived on in the threads, in the fabric, in the hands of those who followed. The weaver's hands moved steadily, the fabric taking shape under his fingertips, the loom singing its quiet song of history. He was part of something eternal, something far beyond his own lifetime. The world outside would continue to change. The seasons would pass, and the loom would still be here, weaving the threads of life, creating something meaningful, even if it was hidden in the folds of time. The weaver paused once more, his eyes lingering on the loom. There was something sacred in this act of creation, something timeless. And though he knew that his time with the loom was limited, that the world was shifting beneath him, he found peace in the knowledge that he had done his part. The fabric he created today, the threads he wove with his hands, would carry his spirit into the future, into the unbroken cycle of life and death, creation and destruction, joy and sorrow. The weaver smiled softly as he continued his work, knowing that in this moment, in this small corner of the world, he was part of something greater than himself, a thread in the fabric of eternity. The weaver sat quietly in front of the loom, his fingers gently running over the worn threads that had once been vibrant, but now seemed to have faded with time. It was a quiet day in the cottage, the light streaming softly through the small window, casting long shadows across the wooden floor. The loom, now an old companion, stood in the corner, its once polished surface dull from years of use. Yet there was a certain beauty in its wear, a history etched into its very frame, a testament to the countless hours of work that had gone into its creation and the generations of hands that had worked upon it. The shuttle once moved with swift purpose, now glided slowly with deliberate care, as the weaver knew his time with the loom was drawing to a close. The threads that now lay beneath his fingers were the final ones, the last he would ever weave into fabric. He could feel the weight of each passing moment, the significance of this final piece he was creating. The air in the room felt thick with memories, each thread that had been woven before carrying the echoes of those who had sat in this very spot, each one contributing to a larger story. Today, it wasn't just about the craft, the fabric, or the physical act of weaving. It was about closure, about the end of a chapter in his life, and the closing of a door that had opened so many years ago. His hands moved slowly, weaving each thread with a kind of reverence, knowing that this piece would be the last mark he would leave on the loom. The world outside continued on, as it always had, with the murmur of voices from the village beyond the cottage walls, the sound of the wind rustling through the trees, and the distant calls of animals stirring in the early morning light. But in the stillness of the room, with only the sound of the shuttle moving across the loom, there was a deep sense of finality. It was as if the world had paused for a brief moment, allowing the weaver to reflect on the work he had done, the life he had lived, and the legacy he would leave behind. As the shuttle moved back and forth, weaving the final threads into the fabric, the weaver's mind wandered to the many years he had spent in this quiet cottage, creating piece after piece, each one a reflection of his soul, his hopes, his dreams, and his struggles. He thought of the days when his children had been small, running through the cottage, laughing as they played in the warmth of the fire. Those days now felt so far away, and yet they lived on in the fabric, in the threads that had been woven with love, care, and a sense of purpose. The weaver had always known that his craft would not last forever, that the loom would eventually fall silent, but he had never imagined it would come so soon. There was a sense of loss in that realization, a sadness that tugged at his heart. As the last threads were woven into the fabric, knowing that this was the final piece he would ever create. But there was also a strange sense of peace in it, a sense that the work had been done, that his time had come to an end, and that the loom would carry on its legacy, even if it were not through his hands. As the final thread slipped through, the loom and the shuttle came to rest. The weaver sat back, his heart heavy but content. The fabric that lay before him was not just a piece of cloth, it was a culmination of his life's work, a symbol of the years he had spent creating, learning, and living. It was a testament to the power of the loom, the power of the hands that had woven it, and the power of the stories that had been passed down through generations. The weaver felt the weight of time upon him, the passage of days, the cycles of seasons, the ebb and flow of life. But as he sat in front of the loom, he also felt the timelessness of it all, the continuity of the craft, the thread that connected him to those who had come before him, and the thread that would continue to connect him to those who would come after. With a sigh, the weaver stood, his body stiff from hours of sitting, and he gently lifted the finished piece from the loom. The fabric, now complete, felt heavy in his hands, a symbol of everything he had poured into it, his life, his love, his labor. He carefully folded the fabric, placing it on the table beside him. It was the last piece he would ever create, and yet he knew it would live on long after he was gone. The loom, though silent, would continue to carry on its legacy, its rhythm echoing through the generations. The weaver took a final look at the loom, his hands lingering on the smooth wood of its frame. It had been a faithful companion, a tool that had shaped his life in ways he could never fully explain. And now, as he turned away from it, he knew that it was time to let go. The work had been done, the fabric had been created, and his journey had come to its natural end. With one last glance at the loom, the weaver left the cottage, stepping out into the world beyond. He knew that his time had passed, But he also knew that his work would live on, woven into the fabric of history, passed down through the generations, carrying with it the stories of those who had worked with it, loved it, and made it their own. As he walked away, he smiled, content in the knowledge that the loom had done its job, and he had done his. The threads had been woven, and the fabric of his life had been completed. The village had always been quiet, a place where the passage of time was marked not by the clamor of bustling streets, but by the soft rustling of leaves in the wind, the gentle hum of daily life, and the steady rhythm of tasks that had been passed down for generations. But now, as the sun dipped low on the horizon and the air turned cool with the evening, there was a feeling in the air that something was changing. The weaver had worked tirelessly for years, his hands moving with practice, ease over the loom, weaving the stories of his life into the fabric he created. Each thread, each knot, each movement was a small piece of the greater tapestry that told the story of his existence. A story made up of moments of joy, sorrow, loss, love, and the quiet beauty of the world around him. The loom had been his constant companion, the tool through which he had translated the world into something tangible, something that would endure long after the seasons had turned and the years had passed. But tonight, as he sat at the loom for the final time, the fabric before him seemed to speak a language that only he could understand, its patterns and colors shifting and changing like the landscape of his own life. The light from the fire flickered, softly, casting shadows across the room, and the crackling of the hearth was the only sound that broke the stillness. Outside, the village was quiet, the distant hum of the world fading into the night. But inside, in the warmth of the cottage, the weaver sat alone, the loom standing still before him, as if waiting for him to make one final mark upon it. His fingers brushed against the threads one last time, the sensation of the soft wool against his skin sending a ripple of memories through his mind. He remembered the first time he had sat before the loom, his hands awkward and unsure, the threads slipping through his fingers as he learned the craft that would become the center of his world. He remembered the early days when his children would play around him, their laughter filling the air as he worked, their joy a reminder of the life he had created for them. And he remembered the quiet moments in the evening when the work was done and the family would gather around the hearth, sharing stories, food, and the warmth of being together. Those days felt so distant now, as if they belonged to another life, another time. The years had passed, the children had grown, and the loom had become a symbol of everything he had built and everything he had lost. But tonight there was a sense of finality in the air, a sense that the time had come to let go of the loom, to move on from the life he had known. He had woven so many pieces over the years, each one a reflection of his soul, but now the tapestry was complete. The threads had all been woven into place, and there was nothing more to add. The weaver sat back, his hands resting on his knees, and looked at the loom one last time. The silence in the room was profound, and for a moment it felt as though the world had stopped turning. The weaver had always known that his time with the loom would eventually come to an end, but he had never imagined it would feel like this, like saying goodbye to a piece of himself, a part of his identity that had been with him for so long. Yet, as he sat there, he realized that the loom had never really been his alone. It had belonged to the generations that had come before him, to those who had sat at its frame and woven their own stories into the fabric of history. And now it would belong to those who would come after him, who would continue the tradition, adding their own threads to the ever-growing tapestry of life. With a deep breath, the weaver stood, his old bones creaking as he moved toward the door. He took one last look at the loom, the fabric that had once held his hopes and dreams, the silent witness to the passage of his life. And then, with a quiet sense of peace, he stepped outside into the cool evening air. The stars shone brightly above, and the village was still, as if waiting for something. The weaver walked slowly, his footsteps soft on the earth, and as he looked up at the night sky, he felt a sense of connection to everything around him, the land, the people, the loom, and the stories that had been woven into time. It was as if the threads of his life were still there, stretching out before him, linking him to the past and to the future, a part of something much larger than himself. The loom may have been silent, but its legacy would live on in the fabric of life, woven together by the hands of those who came before and those who would come after. And with that thought, the weaver smiled softly, knowing that, in the end, the stories he had woven would never truly be finished. They would continue, carried on the threads of time, through the hands of those who understood the quiet beauty of the craft. The weaver's journey had come to its end, but the tapestry of his life would continue to unfold, one thread at a time, weaving its way through the fabric of history, ever changing, ever growing, everlasting. And as he walked away, he carried with him the peace of knowing that his work had been done, that his threads had been woven with love and care, and that, in some small way, he had helped to create something that would endure long after he was gone. The loom, though silent now, would carry on its legacy, a testament to the power of craft, of memory, and of the human spirit. As dawn's first light whispered through the narrow cracks in the humble cottage, the weaver's day began anew, a continuation of the timeless rhythm that had defined his life for as long as memory could stretch. The wooden beams above him creaked, softly as though the house itself sighed into wakefulness, sharing in the quiet anticipation that came with the start of each new day. The village, still wrapped in the fog of early morning, seemed to pause for a moment as the weaver rose, stretching, his hands in the air, feeling the weight of the earth beneath him as he prepared to carry out his sacred craft once more. He moved with a purposeful calm, his fingers brushing against the woolen skeins, soft as whispers, that lay neatly in baskets beside him. The thread was the lifeblood of his work wool spun from sheep that grazed on the distant hills, each fiber infused with the love and care of those who tended the flocks. The dyes, carefully collected from the roots of trees, the berries in the woods, and the petals of the wildflowers, gave each piece a depth of meaning that could never be captured in mere words. To the weaver, each spool of thread, each subtle hue, told a story that had been handed down through generations, woven into the very fabric of the village itself. As his hands worked with steady precision, drawing the shuttle back and forth, the loom creaked with a rhythm that echoed the heartbeat of the earth. The patterns began to emerge, delicate and intricate, like the tapestry of life itself, unfolding one thread at a time. It was a dance that had been performed countless times before, but to the weaver, it was always fresh, always new, a meditation, in motion. His mind wandered to thoughts of the past, the festivals, the harvests, the quiet moments by the fire shared with those he loved, each memory a thread in the tapestry of his own life. With each pass of the shuttle, the fabric grew, each line and curve representing the passage of time, the melding of individual stories into one collective whole. The village outside remained still, the soft murmur of early risers blending with the far-off sound of hooves on stone, signaling the start of another day. As the weaver's fingers danced with the loom, he thought of those who would wear his creations, the families who would wrap themselves in the warmth of his work, the children who would play and grow in clothes made by his hands. In those simple acts of giving, he found purpose and peace. The patterns he wove were not just threads and colors. They were the stories of life, of joy, of sorrow, and of the quiet beauty of existence. Yet the weaver knew that his work was not just an act. of creation. It was an act of preservation. The very act of weaving was a way of holding on to the past, of ensuring that the memories and lessons of those who came before him were passed on to those who would follow. The loom was not just a tool, it was a bridge connecting the generations, linking past and future in a continuous, unbroken cycle. As the sun climbed higher, casting a golden light upon the earth, the weaver's work continued, steady and sure, a meditation on the beauty of life, woven into the fabric of time itself. And as the day unfolded, the threads he wove stretched, far beyond his cottage, far beyond the village, reaching into the hearts of all those who would wear his creations, each one carrying with it a piece of his soul, a piece of his heart. With each new line, the weaver found himself more deeply entwined with the world around him, bound by the threads of fate that, like the yarns he spun, wove their way through time, carrying with them the stories of those who had lived before, him and those who would come after. And in the quiet, gentle rhythm of his work, he found a peace that transcended time, a peace that flowed through every thread he touched, binding the past to the present and weaving a future rich with possibility, all within the simple act of weaving. The sun had reached its zenith, casting a brilliant golden light through the small window of the weaver's cottage. The loom stood in quiet defiance of the passing hours, its wooden frame smooth and worn, polished by years of use and the subtle caress of the weaver's hands. Each movement, each gentle press of the shuttle, seemed to carry the weight of centuries of knowledge, of craft passed down from those who had walked before him, their hands shaping fabric just as his did now, their hearts beating in time with the rhythm of the loom. As the threads twisted and turned, interlocking with one another, the weaver could not help but feel that he was not merely crafting a piece of cloth. He was weaving the very essence of history itself. The soft hum of the village outside, a gentle melody of life unfolding, blended with the soft creak of the loom and the crackle of the hearth fire, filling the room with a comforting rhythm. It was a moment suspended in time, where past and present coexisted, each moment folding into the next with effortless grace. The weaver's mind wandered as his hands worked, his thoughts drifting toward the legacy of his craft. He thought of the generations before him, of the elders who had taught him the trade, their faces etched with the wisdom of experience, their hands deft and sure, their movements as fluid and graceful as the river that wound its way through the valley. They had taught him not only the technical aspects of the craft, but also the deeper truths, the understanding that the act of weaving was a reflection of life itself, a metaphor for the interconnections of all things. Each thread was a story, each pattern a journey, and each piece of cloth a testament to the enduring beauty of life's simple rhythms. The weaver smiled softly, his heart swelling with gratitude. He was part of something much larger than himself, part of an endless cycle that stretched far beyond his own lifetime. The loom, like time itself, was infinite and unbroken thread that continued to weave, generation after generation, ever onward, ever forward. As he continued to work, the fabric took shape, the colors blending together like the seasons that passed in their eternal cycle. He could see the patterns emerging, delicate motifs that reflected the beauty of nature, the soft swirls of the wind, the gentle sway of the trees, the curves of the river as it meandered through the land. The weaver's fingers moved with confidence, guided by instinct and memory, the weight of his ancestors' teachings in every press, every pull of the thread. Yet despite the deep connection he felt to the past, the weaver knew that his craft was not merely about tradition. It was also about transformation. The fabric he created was not just a replication of what had come before. It was a continuation of it, a new chapter in a never-ending story. With every piece of cloth, he added his own voice to the conversation of the generations. The loom was a bridge between what had been and what was yet to come. He thought of the young apprentices who had begun to arrive in the village, eager to learn the ways of the loom. They, too, would one day take their place at the weaving frame, their hands guided by the lessons of the past, their hearts filled with the same sense of reverence that had been passed down to him. It was their turn now to continue the cycle, to carry the torch forward, just as he had done before them. The weaver knew that, in time, the loom would no longer be his alone. It would belong to the next generation, and then to the next, until the end of time. But that, he thought with a quiet sense of peace, was the beauty of it all. It was the legacy of life itself, constantly evolving, constantly changing, yet always anchored in the same fundamental truths. And so, with each pass of the shuttle, the weaver continued his work, knowing that he was not just crafting fabric. He was crafting a legacy that would outlast him, that would carry his story long after his hands had ceased to weave, carried forward by the very threads he had so carefully crafted. The loom, in its infinite wisdom, would continue its work, weaving the past into the present and the present into the future forever. The evening sky stretched above the weaver's cottage, painting the world in hues of lavender and gold, casting long shadows that intertwined with the soft glow of the hearth. The loom stood in the center of the room, its wooden frame now worn and familiar, a companion that had been with the weaver through countless seasons. Yet, as he sat before it, there was a quiet sense of change in the air, as if something was shifting within the very fibers of time itself. The threads he wove were not as vibrant as they once had been, their colors muted and softened by years of constant use. They had aged like the weaver himself, worn and frayed by the passage of time, but still holding the strength and beauty that had defined them from the beginning. As his hands worked, the shuttle gliding between the threads with practiced ease, the weaver could not help but reflect on the years that had passed, the countless hours spent at this loom, weaving the stories of the village, of the land, and of his own life. Every thread had a memory attached to it, every pattern a chapter in the story he had been telling for so long. Yet, as the days passed and the seasons changed, he could feel the pull of the inevitable. Time, like the threads of the loom, was slipping away, and there were moments when the weaver wondered how much longer he could continue his work. The weight of age was settling in his bones, the aches and pains of years spent bending over the loom becoming more pronounced with each passing day. The vibrant colors of his youth had faded, replaced by the more muted tones of experience, and though he continued to weave with the same dedication and care, there was a part of him that wondered if the threads were beginning to unravel. His thoughts wandered to the younger generation of weavers, the apprentices who had come to learn the craft. They were eager and full of life, their hands quick and sure as they moved through the motions of weaving. But the weaver knew that they, too, would face the same challenges in time. It was the natural order of things, one generation passing the torch to the next, the endless cycle of creation and renewal. But still, there was a pang of sorrow in his heart, a quiet longing for the days when he had been as full of energy as they were when his hands had moved without hesitation and the colors of his work had been bright and bold. The weaver's mind returned to the loom before him, the shuttle moving back and forth in rhythmic succession, each pass a reminder of the work still to be done. Yet there was a part of him that sensed a deeper shift, a sense that the threads he wove were no longer as strong as they once were. They were still beautiful, still full of meaning, but they were beginning to fray at the edges, their connection to the past growing more tenuous with each passing day. The weaver's hands, though steady, were no longer as quick as they once had been, his movements a little slower, a little more deliberate. The once familiar motions were becoming more challenging, and the weaver could not help but feel the weight of his own mortality pressing down on him. He thought of the generations that had come before him, the hands that had woven the threads of history long before he had ever taken his place at the loom. Their stories were woven into the fabric of the village, their voices echoing in the quiet hum of the loom. And yet, as time passed, those voices grew softer, fading into the distance like the last whispers of a forgotten dream. The weaver knew that his time was approaching, that soon the shuttle would pass from his hands to the next generation, and he would leave behind only the fabric he had created. But even as he felt the weight of his own passage, there was a sense of peace in knowing that the loom would continue its work, that the threads of history would continue to be woven, even after he was gone. The village would carry on, the younger weavers would take their place, and the legacy of the craft would persist, even as the weaver's hands grew frail and his once vibrant threads faded into memory. As the day drew to a close, the weaver sat back, his hands resting on the worn wood of the loom, his eyes lingering on the fabric he had woven. It was not as bold as it once had been, not as vibrant or full of life, but it was still beautiful, still meaningful. And in that quiet moment, as the last rays of the sun slipped away and the room was filled with the soft light of the hearth, the weaver felt a deep sense of gratitude. He had woven his story, and though the threads might fade, the fabric of his life would remain, woven into the very fabric of the village, passed down from generation to generation. The loom would continue its work, and so would the stories, carried forward in the quiet hum of the shuttle and the steady rhythm of time. As the morning mist swirled lazily through the village, a subtle shift in the air seemed to echo the weaver's thoughts. The loom, which had been his constant companion through countless years, now stood before him with a sense of quiet resignation. The same loom that had once carried the vibrant energy of youth, woven with threads of hope, love, and community, now felt heavier, more burdened by the weight of time. Yet, as the weaver sat before it, his hands moving to the warped threads, there was a new energy in the room, a quiet hum that suggested a deep, unspoken change was taking place. The shuttle glided between the threads with the same rhythmic ease it always had. But there was a difference today, a subtle tension in the movement, a sense of anticipation. The weaver's fingers, though aged and stiff, still moved with grace and precision, their motions an embodiment of years spent honing this craft. He had woven countless patterns, each one an expression of the world around him, each thread imbued with memories, stories, and meaning. Yet today, as his hands worked, there was an awareness, a knowing that the patterns of the past were slowly giving way to something new. The weaver's mind wandered to the apprentices he had taught over the years. They were no longer children, eager and full of questions, but young adults now, confident in their own skill and vision. He had watched them grow, had shared with them his knowledge and his wisdom, and in doing so, had allowed the craft to move beyond his own hands. It was time. He had always known it, but today, as he worked the loom with a slow, deliberate rhythm, the truth was undeniable. The torch was passing, and the weaver was prepared to let it go. His thoughts returned to the fabric before him, the threads weaving together to create a pattern that was both familiar and foreign. There was something new in the way the fibers twisted together, something different in the way they caught the light. The colors were softer now, less defined, the contrast of dark and light blurred into a gentler gradient, as though the fabric itself was adapting to the changes taking place within the weaver's own heart. His eyes traced the design, and for the first time in years, he saw something beyond the familiar patterns that had defined his work for so long. There was a quiet beauty in the irregularity of the weave, in the way the threads seemed to speak to one another, forming something entirely new from the spaces in between. It was as though the loom itself had sensed the weaver's unspoken thoughts and had begun to weave its own story, one that transcended the past and embraced the future. The weaver paused, his fingers lingering on the threads as the realization struck him. The fabric was no longer just his story to tell. It was the village's story, the story of the land, of the seasons, of the lives that intersected with his own. It was a tapestry that was never truly finished, one that would continue to grow, evolve, and change long after he was gone. The loom, like the village itself, was a living thing, constantly in motion, constantly being shaped by the forces of time and experience. He had woven his part, but now it was time to step aside and allow the next chapter to unfold. The apprentices would take over the work now, but the legacy of the loom, of the craft, would endure. And just as the weaver had passed down his knowledge to them, so too would they pass it on to the next generation. The cycle would continue unbroken as long as there were hands willing to hold the shuttle and threads to weave. For the first time in many years, the weaver felt at peace with the changes that were unfolding. There was no fear in his heart, only a quiet sense of gratitude for the years he had spent weaving, for the stories he had shared, for the connections he had made. The loom would live on, and the weaver would leave behind a tapestry of memories, woven with the threads of his life. As the day wore on, and the soft light of the sun filtered through the window, the weaver sat back, his work complete for the day. He looked at the fabric before him, the new pattern that had emerged from the loom, and he smiled. It was a beautiful thing, imperfect yet full of life, full of the essence of the village, full of the essence of time. The loom was still at work, still weaving the threads of the future, and the weaver knew that his place in that story had been fulfilled. It was time to rest, time to let go, time to pass the torch to those who would come after him. The fabric of life, like the fabric of the loom, would continue to unfold, and with it, the stories of the village would continue to be told. The weaver was ready to step back, content in the knowledge that his work had been done, that his threads had been woven into the tapestry of history. The loom would carry on, and so would the stories, carried forward by the hands of those who would continue the craft, those who would carry the legacy of the weaver into the future. And as the night fell over the village, the weaver closed his eyes, a quiet peace settling in his heart, knowing that the threads of time would continue to weave, uninterrupted, for generations to come. The village lay still beneath a thick quilt of fog, the kind that seemed to mute even the whispers of the early morning. The loom stood in the center of the weaver's small cottage, quiet now, like a sentinel waiting for the touch of its master. Yet it was no longer the same loom that had hummed with life and purpose in the hands of its creator. Now it was something else, something more. It seemed to carry the weight of generations, its frame polished by time and use, its threads imbued with stories told and untold. The weaver had long since left the cottage, his hands no longer grasping the shuttle, but his presence lingered, woven into the very fibers of the loom. The fabric it had created over the years now spoke with a voice all its own, one that resonated. In the stillness of the room, it was a song without sound, a melody that could only be felt. The apprentice, who had learned under the weaver's watchful eye, stood before it now, his hands trembling with both reverence and responsibility. He had always known that this moment would come, though he could never have anticipated how heavy it would feel. The loom was no longer a tool, it had become a vessel, a keeper of memory, and he was its new steward. The threads that lay across the loom now were not just fibers of wool, cotton, or linen. They were the very essence of the village, the lives that had passed through it, the seasons that had shaped its landscape, the dreams that had been woven into every inch of the fabric. As the apprentice's fingers grazed the threads, he could almost hear the voices of those who had sat in this very room, their words carried through time, imbued into the strands of each piece of cloth. The loom had borne witness to so much joy, Sorrow, love, loss, and now it was ready to tell a new story. The apprentice could feel the weight of the loom's legacy pressing upon him. It was a gift, yes, but also a challenge, for the loom could not simply be used in the same way. It had its own rhythm, its own demands. It required patience, humility, and a deep understanding of the subtle art of weaving that the weaver had passed down over the years. Yet, as the apprentice sat before the loom, he felt a quiet sense of clarity. He was not meant to recreate the past. The weaver's work was done, his legacy complete. Now, it was the apprentice's turn to shape the future of the loom. He would add his own stories, his own memories, his own threads to the fabric that had been so carefully crafted before. The shuttle slid effortlessly through the warped threads, the rhythm of the loom soothing his nerves as his hands moved in fluid motions, learning the dance that had been passed down through generations. Each movement felt natural, as though the loom was guiding him, teaching him the ways of its craft. And yet, in the quiet moments between the rhythmic movements, the apprentice couldn't help but wonder about the weaver. What had he felt in this very room, sitting in this same spot, his hands working the shuttle with such ease and grace? Had he known that the loom would one day be passed on to another? Had he felt the weight of time the way the apprentice did? Now, knowing that his work would become the foundation for something new? The loom answered him in its own way, the threads pulling gently, almost as if to reassure him that his place in this tapestry was just as vital as the weaver's had been. It was a silent conversation, one that transcended words and touched. Something deeper, something older. The apprentice's mind drifted, his fingers pausing as he remembered the first time he had sat at the loom, the weaver beside him, guiding him with patience and wisdom. The early years had been difficult, filled with frustration and mistakes. But slowly, over time, the apprentice had begun to understand the rhythm of the craft. And now, as he sat alone at the loom, he realized that he was no longer simply following the weaver's instructions. He was creating something entirely his own. The first threads of the new tapestry were being woven, and with each one, he could feel the weight of history, of tradition, being carried forward. The loom had been the weaver's voice, and now it was his. As the sun rose higher in the sky, casting soft rays through the cottage's small window, the apprentice leaned back in his chair, looking at the fabric that was slowly taking shape beneath his hands. It was a beautiful thing, simple yet profound. It was not the weaver's work, but it was no less important. It was a continuation, a new chapter in the story that had been unfolding for generations. And as the loom hummed its silent song, the apprentice knew that this was only the beginning. The fabric of life was still being woven, thread by thread, each new stitch adding to the tapestry of the village, of the land, and of the people who had come before him. In that moment, the apprentice understood the true meaning of the craft. It was not about creating something perfect. It was about creating something that would live on, something that would carry the essence of those who came before, and those who would come after. And as the shuttle moved once more through the loom, he felt a deep sense of peace. The loom had found its new keeper, its new voice, and together they would continue to weave the story of the village, a story that would never truly end. It would be carried forward, carried on the threads of time, until the end of days. As the first light of dawn seeped through the thin curtains, casting a pale golden glow across the weaver's quiet cottage, a sense of calm enveloped the space. The loom, which had been passed down through generations, now stood silent, its threads eagerly waiting for their master's touch. The air was crisp, the faint scent of last night's fire still lingering, and a hush seemed to hang in the room, as if the very walls knew what was about to unfold. The apprentice, now fully immersed in his craft, had spent countless hours sitting, At the loom, his hands moving with practiced grace as the shuttle glided back and forth, weaving the threads into intricate patterns. It was a dance, a rhythmic motion that mirrored the passage of time itself. Each thread that passed through his fingers told a story, one that was rooted in the past but also looked toward the future. The apprentice had long since stopped thinking of the loom as just a tool. It had become a living entity, a bridge between generations and a keeper of the village's soul. He had spent years learning from the weaver, and now, as he sat alone before it, he felt a deep connection to all those who had come before him, whose hands had once worked the loom with such care and dedication. But today, as the sun rose higher, casting its light over the loom, the apprentice knew something had changed. There was a subtle shift in the air, a quiet anticipation that filled the room. It was as if the loom itself was calling him to create something new, something that had never been seen before. The patterns that had once been guided by tradition and the teachings of the past were now his to shape. The weight of this responsibility settled on his shoulders, but rather than feeling burdened, he felt a sense of exhilaration. The loom, with its ancient wood and worn threads, had been waiting for this moment, waiting for him to step into the role that had once been filled by the weaver. The shuttle, now held firmly in his hands, seemed to hum with energy, as though it too understood the significance of this moment. The apprentice took a deep breath, centering himself as he prepared to begin. The warped threads stretched taut before him, their colors vibrant and rich, ready to be woven into something beautiful. The patterns that emerged would be a reflection of his own experiences, his own journey, and his own understanding of the world around him. With the first movement of the shuttle, the fabric began to take shape. It was unlike anything the village had seen before, something fresh, something bold. The patterns flowed from the loom, as though they were part of him, each thread representing a thought, a memory, a feeling that he had once held in his heart. The loom seemed to respond to his every movement, its creaks and groans in perfect harmony with the rhythm of his hands. The apprentice smiled softly as he worked, feeling a deep sense of fulfillment as the fabric grew beneath his fingers. This was not just the continuation of the weaver's legacy. This was his own story being woven into the very fabric of the village. With every pass of the shuttle, he felt more and more connected to the loom, to the generations that had come before, and to the future that lay ahead. He knew that this fabric, when it was completed, would carry the essence of the village itself. The people who wore it would carry with them a piece of history, a piece of the land, and a piece of the past that would never be forgotten. As the morning sun climbed higher, filling the cottage with warmth, the apprentice's hands moved faster, more confidently. The loom responded with a quiet, steady hum, as if it too was pleased with the work that was unfolding. The patterns became more intricate, more detailed, and with each pass of the shuttle, the apprentice's understanding of the loom deepened. It was no longer just about weaving cloth. It was about weaving stories, emotions, and memories into every inch of the fabric. The day passed slowly, the sun shifting in the sky as the apprentice continued his work. The loom, now fully alive, in his hands, seemed to breathe with him, its ancient wood resonating with each movement of the shuttle. The village outside remained quiet, its sounds muffled by the walls of the cottage, but the apprentice could sense the world beyond. The life of the village, the rhythm of the seasons, and the stories of the people, all woven into the fabric he was creating. As the evening approached, the apprentice leaned back in his chair, exhausted but satisfied. The fabric was nearly complete, and he could see the patterns now, clear as day. They were a reflection of his journey, of his time spent learning from the weaver, and of the new path he was forging for himself. This fabric, he realized, was more than just cloth. It was a testament to his growth, his understanding, and his place in the story of the village. The loom, having guided him through This process stood silent once more, its work done for the day. The apprentice stood and stretched, feeling the satisfaction of a day well spent. As he looked at the fabric he had created, he felt a deep sense of pride. This was his creation, his legacy to carry forward, and he knew that it would carry the stories of the village for generations to come. Tomorrow, he would begin anew, but for now, he allowed himself to rest. The loom would be waiting for him, just as it had always been, its silent song ready to continue, one thread at a time. The quiet of the weaver's cottage, now alive with the hum of the loom and the steady rhythm of the apprentice's movements, felt timeless, as though the hands that had crafted this place long before were still present, guiding him, watching him. The walls, lined with the echoes of past generations, seemed to hold a deep, ancient wisdom that had been passed down in threads, one after another, from hand to hand, from the weaver to the apprentice. Each time the shuttle moved across the loom, it was as though time itself was being woven into the fabric, connecting the past, present, and future into a seamless whole. The apprentice, now more confident than ever, felt a sense of awe as he worked, his fingers gliding over the threads with a precision that felt almost instinctual, a deep connection to the loom that went beyond technique. It was as if the loom itself had become an extension of his soul, a living testament to the rhythm of his thoughts, his heart, and his aspirations. With every movement, the patterns began to emerge, slowly at first, but with increasing clarity, each pass of the shuttle revealing new possibilities, new stories, new moments of quiet reflection that had been hidden within the warped threads. The loom was no longer a tool, but a gateway, a portal that connected him to the very heartbeat of the village, to the seasons that passed outside the cottage, and to the long history of those who had come before him. The weaver's teachings, though now distant, still lingered in the corners of the room, in the very air that hung heavy with the scent of wool and wood, and in the very act of weaving itself. The apprentice, with each passing day, had come to understand that the loom was not just a craft to be mastered. It was a language that transcended time and space, one that told stories without words, that captured moments and memories in the threads that wound together under the steady rhythm of the shuttle. It was a language that spoke to the earth, to the seasons, to the people who walked the village streets, and to the deep, hidden currents that connected all things. The patterns that took shape on the loom were like maps, intricate and beautiful, each stitch a point on a vast, unseen tapestry that told the story of the world itself, from the smallest detail to the grandest vision. There was a rhythm in the work, a meditative flow that brought clarity to the mind and peace to the heart. As the days stretched into weeks, the apprentice's work began to change. It was no longer about replicating the past, about following the weaver's footsteps, or trying to match the patterns that had been passed down. Instead, he began to weave his own story into the fabric, his own voice, his own vision. The loom became a mirror, reflecting not just the world around him, but the world within him, capturing the quiet moments of his thoughts and dreams. It was no longer a quiet, solitary process. It was a dialogue, a conversation between him, the loom, between him and the threads that he wove together. Each new pattern that emerged felt like a discovery, a revelation that carried with it the weight of his own journey. He had once been an outsider, an observer, unsure of his place in the story of the weaver. But now, as the threads passed through his fingers, he realized that he was no longer an outsider. He was part of the tapestry, his own story now woven into the fabric of the village. It was a humbling thought, one that filled him with a deep sense of gratitude, but also with a quiet sense of pride. His work, though still young and evolving, was now his own. The patterns he created were unique a blend of tradition and innovation, the old and the new coming together in a harmonious dance that spoke to both the past and the future. The village, once distant and foreign to him, now felt like a part of him, its rhythms and sounds intertwined with his own. As he worked, he could hear the faint murmur of life. Outside the cottage, the laughter of children, the soft conversations of neighbors, the clatter of tools being used in nearby workshops, all blending together in a gentle hum that echoed, the rhythm of the loom. The seasons had passed, one after another, each bringing its own changes to the village. And now, as the apprentice worked at the loom, he could feel the shift in the air, the gentle breeze that signaled the approach of a new season, a new chapter in the story of the village. The loom had been a constant, a steady presence through it all, and as he sat before it now, weaving the final threads into place, he realized that the loom was not just a part of the village's story. It was the story itself. It had witnessed the passage of time, the coming and going of seasons, the changes in the village, and the lives of the people who had lived there. It had woven their stories into the fabric, thread by thread, capturing the essence of their lives in each intricate design. And now, as he added his own threads to the tapestry, he felt as though he were participating in something far greater than himself. The loom had become a bridge, linking generations, connecting the past and the present, and it was now his turn to add his mark to it. With the last few threads woven into place, the fabric was complete. The shuttle fell silent, and the loom stood still, its work done for the moment. The apprentice sat back, exhausted but content, and looked at the cloth before him. It was more than just a piece of fabric. It was a testament to his journey, to the lessons he had learned, to the growth he had experienced. It was his story, woven into the very fabric of the village. And as he gazed at it, he knew that this was just the beginning. The loom would continue to weave, the patterns would continue to change, and the stories would continue to be told, one thread at a time. The journey was far from over, but for now, the apprentice could rest, knowing that he had added his own thread to the great tapestry of life. The loom, now a silent observer, stood still under the weight of the apprentice's journey, as though recognizing the significance of the moment. The young man sat beside it, hands resting lightly on the edge of the well-worn frame, his thoughts swirling like the threads he had once struggled to master. The patterns that had once eluded him now unfolded before his eyes in a seamless dance of color and shape, each thread a reflection of his evolution, his growth. The hum of the loom, the soft rhythm of the shuttle passing through the threads, seemed like a distant memory, as though the very act of weaving had become a second nature, a deep, primal instinct that flowed through him. Yet, as he gazed at the cloth that lay in front of him, he saw more than just fabric. He saw the culmination of everything he had learned, everything he had experienced, and the quiet understanding that the journey was far from complete. The loom had become more than a tool. It had transformed into a mirror, reflecting his own inner transformation, the intertwining of his dreams and his reality, his past and his future. Each pattern was a chapter in his story, a testament to his perseverance, his patience, and his unwavering commitment to the craft. But there was something deeper at work, something that went beyond technique or mastery. It was as if the loom had begun to speak to him, whispering ancient truths through the delicate movement of the shuttle and the soft tension of the threads. He had come to understand that weaving was not just about creating cloth. It was about weaving the very fabric of his existence, of his identity, of his place in the world. The loom, with its silent presence, had taught him that all things like the threads were interconnected. Life itself was a tapestry, and the choices he made, the actions he took, were the threads that would shape his destiny. The village around him, once a distant backdrop, had now become a part of him. He could feel the pulse of the seasons, the ebb and flow of life in the rhythm of the loom, the laughter of the children in the distance, the soft murmur of the neighbors' voices blending with the crackle of the hearth fire. The weaver, now more than ever, understood that his craft was not an isolated endeavor. It was a shared experience, a collective story woven into the very fabric of the village's existence. He had become a part of that story, his own thread, now woven into the larger tapestry that had been created over generations. But there was still so much to learn, so much more to discover. The apprentice could feel the pull of something greater, a beckoning to continue his journey, to explore the vast expanse of the loom's infinite possibilities. The fabric he had woven was beautiful, intricate, and full of meaning, but he knew that it was only one piece of a much larger story. The loom, with its intricate web of threads, seemed to whisper of things to come, of patterns yet to be revealed. The village, too, held secrets in its quiet corners, its forgotten histories, and untold stories. He had only scratched the surface of what was to come, and though the path ahead was uncertain, he felt a deep sense of peace. The loom had taught him that life was not about perfection or completing a single task. It was about the process, the steady rhythm of weaving, the small decisions that shaped the whole. As he reached for the shuttle once more, he could feel a surge of purpose rise within him, as though the threads of his own fate were calling him forward. The fabric before him, once an empty canvas, was now a reflection of his journey, a testament to the quiet strength that had guided him through his trials. But there was more to come. The next chapter awaited, woven with new challenges, new patterns, new possibilities. The loom, ever patient, stood ready to accompany him, its ancient wood resonating with the promise of the future. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the village, the apprentice continued to weave, the shuttle moving with steady determination, each thread connecting him not only to the past, but to the unfolding story of his future. The loom was no longer just a tool. It had become the thread that tied him to something far greater than himself, a force that guided him forward, through the twists and turns of life, through the beauty and the struggle, through the quiet moments of reflection and the louder, more vibrant moments of discovery. And in that moment, as the last thread was woven into place, he understood. He was no longer just an apprentice. He was a weaver, a creator of worlds, a master of the loom's infinite patterns. And the tapestry of his life was far from complete. It was only just beginning. As the final days of the season unfolded beneath the quiet skies, the weaver, now a man shaped by time, patience, and the unyielding rhythm of his craft, stood in the heart of his humble cottage, his eyes tracing the tapestry of life that stretched across his loom. The threads, once mere strands of wool and linen, had transformed into an intricate reflection of his journey, each one imbued with the memories of his past, the lessons learned, the trials endured, and the triumphs earned. The loom had become his confidant, his teacher, and his silent partner in the journey of self-discovery. He could now see the patterns clearly, the way his life had unfolded, the ebb and flow of moments and experiences, like threads winding through the loom's framework. The air was heavy with the scent of freshly spun wool, mingling with the faint, smoky aroma of the hearth fire still smoldering in the corner, casting a warm amber glow across the room. Outside, the village continued its steady rhythm, the clattering of wooden carts on cobblestone streets, the distant sound of children playing in the fields, the soft murmur of voices exchanged over fences, all blending into the tapestry of life that stretched beyond the walls of his cottage. But within these four walls, within the steady movement of the loom, was the pulse of his own journey, a journey that had come to define him in ways he had never imagined. The shuttle moved with deliberate grace, Each passed through the warped threads, creating new patterns, new connections. And with each passing moment, the weaver felt himself drawn deeper into the fabric of his own story. The loom had taught him more than technique. It had shown him that life was not a series of isolated moments, but a vast and intricate tapestry, woven together by the choices, the experiences, and the people who crossed his path. Every thread, whether bright and vibrant or muted and somber, had its place in the greater design. He thought back to his early days as an apprentice, struggling with the simple task of aligning the threads, watching them slip through his fingers like fleeting moments. How far he had come, not just in skill, but in understanding. He had learned that it was not the perfection of the weave that mattered, but the process, the slow, deliberate creation of something larger than oneself, the quiet moments of reflection woven into each strand, each decision that shaped the future. The loom, ever patient, had taught him to embrace the uncertainty of the patterns, to trust the flow of the shuttle, and to welcome the rhythm of the work. As the seasons had passed, so too had his understanding of his place in the world evolved. He was no longer merely a craftsman. He had become a creator, a weaver of worlds, each one woven from the threads of his own life, his own experiences. And yet, despite all that he had learned, the weaver knew that the tapestry was far from finished. The future, like the loom, stretched out before him, its threads waiting to be shaped and guided. The world around him had changed, and with it, so had he. The people of the village, too, had transformed. Some had come and gone, their lives woven briefly into the fabric of the community, while others had remained, their threads intertwined with his in ways that were subtle yet profound. The weaver had learned to recognize these connections, the way the village itself had become a part of the greater design of his life, each person playing their role, each moment contributing to the overall story. The loom, like time itself, had shown him that the past was never truly gone. It was woven into the present, like a thread that could not be separated from the rest of the fabric. And the future, too, was never truly unknown. It was simply waiting for the shuttle to pass, for the patterns to form, for the next chapter to be written. As the day faded into twilight, the weaver paused, his hands resting gently on the loom, his mind reflecting on the journey that had brought him here. He had once stood at the edge of his own life, uncertain of where the threads would lead, unsure of what patterns would emerge. But now, as the evening sky turned from pale blue to deep indigo, he saw his life for what it was, a continuous weave of moments, each one precious and fleeting, each one connected to the next. And in that moment, the weaver understood the tapestry was not a destination, but a journey, an endless process of creation, reflection, and growth. It was a story that would continue as long as the loom stood, as long as the shuttle moved, and as long as the threads of life continued to weave themselves into the fabric of his existence. The weaver smiled softly, feeling a quiet peace settle over him. The loom was ready for the next thread, ready for the next chapter in his story. And with that understanding, he lifted the shuttle once more, feeling the steady rhythm of his work pulse through him. The loom, like his life, was far from finished, and he, like the tapestry, was forever in the process of becoming. As the final rays of the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting a golden glow across the weaver's cottage, the loom stood still, its once vibrant threads now fading into the evening light. The weaver, now an old man with hands worn from years of crafting, sat in front of the loom, his gaze fixed on the fabric he had spent a lifetime weaving. His mind, once consumed with the meticulous craft of his trade, was now full of memories, the faces of those who had passed through his life, the moments of quiet reflection, the laughter of children playing in the streets, the rustle of the wind through the trees, and the warmth of family gathered around the hearth. All of these, like the threads on his loom, had been woven into the story of his existence, a tapestry of love, loss, and everything in between. The shuttle, once guided by his hands with such precision, now lay silent beside the loom, a symbol of the passage of time, the end of an era. The weaver ran his fingers gently over the final section of the cloth, his touch reverent, as if paying homage to the work that had defined his life. He could see the patterns clearly now, the lessons learned, the journeys taken, the sacrifices made. Each thread, once a simple strand of wool or linen, had become a part of something larger, something eternal. The fabric was no longer just a work of art. It was a reflection of his soul, his spirit, his journey. As the last moments of daylight slipped away, the weaver stood, his body weary, but his heart at peace. He took a deep breath, inhaling the cool, crisp air of the evening, and walked to the small window of his cottage, looking out at the village below. The houses, the streets, the fields, everything was as it had always been. And yet, everything was different. The world had continued to turn, seasons had passed, and life had unfolded in ways he could not have predicted. But in the quiet of his cottage, in the stillness of the loom, he felt the weight of his life's work. The tapestry, his tapestry, was complete. It was a life well lived, a life marked by creation, by connection, and by the simple beauty of everyday moments. The weaver knew that his time had come, that the loom would no longer be his to guide. But he was not afraid. He had seen enough of life to know that endings were but new beginnings, that the threads of existence never truly ended. They simply transformed, woven into the fabric of something greater. With one final glance at the loom, the weaver turned and made his way to the hearth, where the fire still burned softly. He settled into his favorite chair, the familiar warmth wrapping around him like an old friend. His hands, once strong and steady, now rested in his lap, his eyes closing as he let the peaceful silence of the evening wash over him. The world outside continued on, as it always had, and would long after his final breath. But in that moment, in that quiet, serene moment, the weaver knew that he had left his mark. The tapestry of his life would continue, woven into the hearts and minds of those who had come before and those who would come after. The loom, though silent, had told his story, a story of resilience, of love, of quiet strength. And with that, the weaver closed his eyes, his heart at peace, as the fire flickered softly, casting shadows on the walls that had witnessed the unfolding of a life fully lived. The shuttle lay still, the loom quiet, and the final weave, the final thread was complete.